What if certain places weren't just places, but ancient organisms, made of wood, stone, and patience? What if a house could hold more than furniture and dust, more than cracks and faded portraits, holding instead the invisible pressure of everything ever felt inside it? What if walls were able to remember for us when memory fails on purpose, when the heart learns to protect itself by erasing what hurts? What if death weren't an end, but merely a kind of door, and love, that love that never knows restraint, had the arrogance to try to cross it? What if a promise made in silence, on a night no one else remembers, were still in effect, like a contract signed in blood that time cannot wash away? What if you were walking through life believing you had chosen your path, when in truth you were only obeying an ancient calling, a calling that doesn't come from outside but from within? What if destiny had a specific scent, damp wood, rusted iron, dried flowers, and you began to sense it before you could even see where it came from? What if a place could recognize someone before that person ever entered it? Not recognize them the way one recognizes a face, but the way one recognizes a debt, the way one recognizes a missing piece, the way one recognizes an inevitable return. There are mansions that are just mansions, and there are mansions that are vaults, vaults of memories, vaults of regrets, vaults of promises that lack the courage to die. There are mansions that don't age properly because aging requires forgetting, and some houses do not forget, they accumulate. What if somewhere in the world there existed a structure that breathed under the weight of what it had stored? A place that, for decades, remained too quiet to be normal, too intact to be truly abandoned, as if it had been left deliberately, not to rot, but to wait. Wait for whom? Wait for what? Wait for the exact moment when someone's life, without realizing it, would begin to turn back toward that gate. The story begins with a man who believed himself whole. His name was Gabriel. Not because the name had been chosen with care, but because it was merely the name of the present, a recent label pasted onto something far older. Gabriel was the age of someone who had seen enough to distrust coincidences, but not enough to admit that the impossible is just a kind of reality we choose to avoid. He lived far from there. He had a job, a routine, repetitive days, small obligations that created the illusion of stability. His life was quiet, not because of peace, but because of a lack of risk. And perhaps that is exactly what destiny hates. When someone protects themselves too well, destiny learns to slip in through the cracks. The calling arrived simply, almost shyly, a brown envelope, unperfumed, undramatic, delivered like an overdue bill. Inside were papers discussing inheritance, an old property, a house that needed to be inspected, registered, decided upon. Everything written in cold, formal language capable of turning the word mansion into a bureaucratic item. But beneath the official wording there was a pulse. Gabriel couldn't explain why he agreed to go. He could have delegated. He could have sold it without visiting. He could have ignored it. But the acceptance came with an unsettling naturalness, as if something inside him had already decided beforehand, as if, upon reading the name of the place, he had felt a sharp pull in his chest, an intimate signal of recognition that the mind tried to label as curiosity simply to avoid admitting what it really was. The journey was long, roads that left the city behind and entered regions where the horizon felt heavier. The overcast sky seemed to follow the car like a poorly fitted lid. The farther he went, the more the world emptied of people and noise, and at a certain point the cell signal vanished, not like an inconvenience but like a ritual of isolation. The last stretch of road was dirt. The car moved slowly, bouncing through potholes, kicking up damp dust. Tall, ancient trees leaned over the road as if trying to touch each other above it, forming a tunnel of shadow. The smell of leaves and earth grew stronger, and along with it grew a feeling Gabriel couldn't name without fear. It wasn't ordinary anxiety. It was the sensation of return. When the road ended, the car stopped in front of a tall iron gate, covered in rust and creeping vines. Beyond the gate, a narrow drive led to the mansion, and the mansion was there, in the distance, as if it had been waiting far too long. Large, dark, marked by long cracks and tall windows that reflected the sky without revealing the interior. Gabriel got out of the car and stood still for a few seconds. The silence was so dense it felt woven. A light wind passed, carrying the scent of oxidized metal and invisible flowers. And then the strangest thing happened. Before he touched the gate, he knew with certainty, not suspicion, not an idea, a physical certainty, like a memory of the body. The mansion knew he had arrived. The gate, which should have resisted, gave way far too easily. The groan it made didn't sound like protest, it sounded like recognition, like relief. And as Gabriel walked down the drive, feeling the old gravel beneath his shoes, a sensation rose inside him like a dark, tender tide. The sense that, in crossing that distance toward the front door, he wasn't merely entering an abandoned property. He was entering a forbidden place, not by laws or signs, but by memory, and what awaited him inside was not just a secret, it was destiny. The wood was warm in a way that didn't match the cold air outside. Gabriel kept his hand resting on the doorknob longer than necessary, as if trying to grasp the logic of that detail, as if the explanation were hidden in the temperature, in the contact, in the insistence. The sensation wasn't merely strange, it was intimate, as though the house had skin. The wind blew again through the trees, but now it seemed to come from the mansion, not the forest. A breath that carried fine dust, the scent of old wood, and an almost imperceptible note of perfume, the kind of perfume one doesn't wear by accident, the kind chosen as a signature, as a promise. Gabriel felt his chest tighten for no immediate reason, and that lack of reason frightened him more than any clear cause could have. He pushed the door. It opened with a deep, prolonged sound, not exactly a creak, but a sigh, like something heavy moving after a very long time. The darkness inside wasn't absolute. There was a penumbra composed of filtered light, timid reflections slipping in through tall windows covered by thick curtains. The light seemed afraid to enter. The first smell that struck him was ancient dust, but beneath it there was something deeper, aged wax, stored fabric, old paper, and that nearly faded floral note, as if the perfume had been left there to resist time, as if someone believed a scent could keep a person alive. Gabriel took his first step inside and felt the floor give slightly, as if testing his weight. The sound of the step didn't echo the way it would in an empty house. It returned with a delay, as if deciding whether it should exist. The silence inside wasn't an absence of sound. It was presence, vigilance, accumulated intention. The entry hall was vast, dominated by a curved staircase that rose in two symmetrical flights. The wooden banister was dark, polished by time and by the touch of hands that no longer existed. A massive chandelier hung from the high ceiling, coated in dust but intact, as if waiting for a special occasion to light up again. That kind of preservation doesn't happen by accident in abandoned places. It felt deliberate. The walls displayed old portraits in heavy frames, stern faces, painted eyes that seemed to follow Gabriel with uncomfortable attention. There were men in clothes from another era, women with hairstyles belonging to sepia photographs, and in more than one frame the same expression, a restrained melancholy, as if each person there had loved too much and paid for it. Gabriel walked slowly, trying to keep his mind on practical matters, assessing the structure, checking for damage, understanding the condition of the place. But that rationality felt fragile inside the mansion, like a thin coat on a freezing night. The house had a way of pushing thought downward, into the chest, into instinct. When he reached the center of the hall, he heard a discreet snap from the upper floor. It wasn't the sound an old house makes when wood settles. It was a precise sound, as if someone had moved carefully, someone who tried not to make noise and failed for just a second. Gabriel stopped. The feeling of not being alone settled in like mist. It didn't arrive as a jump scare, but as a gradual certainty. The air felt occupied, and at the same time the mansion seemed satisfied with his presence, as if it had been waiting for that occupancy. He looked toward the staircase. The top landing was dark, and the shadow there felt denser than ordinary shadow. There was no one visible, but there was a sensation, a gentle pressure, as if the space itself were leaning toward him. And then, on the left side of the hall, near a corridor leading to other rooms, Gabriel caught a clearer trace of perfume. It didn't come from the general air, but from a specific point, as if someone had just passed by. White flowers, perhaps jasmine, mixed with something more bitter, like cold tea left too long in a cup. He turned slowly. That was when he saw her, not the way someone appears in a fright, nor the way a figure jumps from a dark corner. It was more like becoming aware of a presence that had always been there, and only now decided to be noticed. At first, Gabriel saw only the shape, a female silhouette in the dimness of the side corridor, standing still, as if the mansion itself had drawn her in shadow and light. As his eyes adjusted, the shape gained detail. It wasn't an illusion. It was someone. A woman, serene in posture, her body partially wrapped in penumbra. Her face wasn't fully lit, but enough for Gabriel to feel the shock. There was a devastating familiarity to her presence, as if he recognized her without having any reason to. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with something that hurt far more than fear, longing. The longing arrived fully formed, complete, as if it had been stored away and was only waiting for a trigger. Gabriel felt his throat tighten, his eyes burn in an absurd way. It made no sense. He had no memories of that woman, no history with her, and yet his body reacted as if the loss of that presence were ancient, as if it had been mourned in another life. The woman remained still, and the mansion around them seemed to quiet, As if respecting the moment, the snaps ceased, the air felt more still. Even the dust and the light appeared suspended. Gabriel heard no words, there was no dialogue, but there was understanding. Silent understanding. Something in that encounter didn't depend on explanation. It was recognition that came from beneath reason, from a place where time has no authority. He took an involuntary step toward her, and as he did, the hall floor creaked, not like old wood, but like confirmation. The mansion approved. The discomfort that had been scattered until then condensed into a single realization. This was not a casual meeting. It was the fulfillment of something. And deep in his chest, Gabriel understood that he wasn't just entering a house. He was stepping into a story that had begun before he was born. The brooch wasn't large, but it carried the kind of presence certain objects have when they've been touched many times with intention. It was an old piece, darkened metal with a pale stone at its center that reflected the corridor's scant light, as if it held its own glow. Gabriel perceived the design with a clarity that made him dizzy. A stylized flower with slender petals, almost like lilies, encircled by small branches. What wounded him most, however, was the intimate certainty that he had seen it before, not in a photograph, not in a museum, not in a family memory. In a dream. A recurring dream, one without plot, only sensation. A dream in which he walked down a long corridor, always in dim light, always hearing his own footsteps echo with delay, and at the end of the corridor someone stood waiting. He never saw the face, but he saw the brooch shining like a small pale eye in the dark, and he always woke with a tight chest, as if he had lost something at the edge of sleep. Now the brooch was there, pinned to the fabric of that real woman's dress, in the waking world. Gabriel felt reality bend slightly, like a sheet of paper pressed at the center. There was no hallucination, no visual distortion. It was an internal distortion, a break in trust in the line separating dream from memory. The woman stepped forward a few more paces and stopped near the entrance to the hall, where the filtered light could touch part of her face. Gabriel couldn't precisely gauge her age. There was youth in her features, but there was also a weariness in her eyes that doesn't belong to those who've lived little. A weariness of waiting, a weariness of repetition. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with questions that couldn't yet be formed. The mansion seemed to observe the encounter the way one watches the reunion of two pieces separated far too long. The walls stretched around them, attentive, as if the entire place were a body trying to feel its own pulse. Gabriel felt the urge to take a deep breath, to organize his thoughts, to return to being the man who drives a car, signs papers, answers emails. But inside that place, the air didn't allow such an easy return. Each breath seemed to bring with it a fragment of something old, and each exhale returned to the house a bit of human warmth it appeared to crave. He followed the direction of the corridor she had come from, not because she beckoned, but because his body understood the path. The corridor was narrower than the hall, lined with closed doors and smaller paintings. The floor was covered with an old carpet, darkened by dust, muffling footsteps unevenly, creating a strange rhythm, as if the corridor were trying to hide or reveal movement at will. The doors along the corridor felt different from the rest of the mansion's doors, less weathered, more preserved, as if someone had decided that time would not be allowed full permission there. Gabriel ran his hand along the wood of one door and felt the smooth, almost polished texture. It didn't match abandonment. The woman moved ahead calmly, and Gabriel noticed she didn't look back to check whether he followed. There was no need. Her certainty was silent and absolute, and that disturbed him more than any threatening gesture could have. The corridor opened into a smaller sitting room, unlike what Gabriel expected from an old mansion. It wasn't grand, it was intimate, made for staying, for long conversations, for nights spent waiting for someone to return. There was a sofa covered in dark fabric, a table marked by old cup rings, a wooden cabinet with shelves full of books. Dust existed there, but it was finer, as if someone passed through that room often enough to prevent decades of accumulation. Gabriel's gaze was drawn to an object on the table, a vase with dried flowers. White flowers, desiccated yet arranged with care. The scent he had noticed since entering seemed concentrated there. Jasmine, perhaps, or something similar. The kind of arrangement someone renews out of habit, even knowing time always wins. As he approached, Gabriel noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The water in the vase hadn't completely evaporated. There was a residue, as if someone had added water recently, or as if evaporation there followed different rules. Then he heard a very subtle sound from somewhere in the house, the distant clink of metal, like a chain being touched. Next came a snap in the ceiling, and the soft sound of something falling in a distant room. Gabriel stood still, listening. The mansion seemed to produce sounds that weren't random, as if responding to each step with small confirmations. The woman, near the window, remained silent. The light filtered through the curtains painted pale bands across her skin. Gabriel perceived that she carried a sadness that wasn't theatrical. It was fundamental, a sadness made of accumulated time, and behind it was something else, care for him. Gabriel felt it in a strange way, as if one could feel someone's care without it being shown. It came as a gentle pressure, like a warning, a love without words but with enough weight to alter the air. He looked again at the brooch. The pale stone caught the light for an instant, and in that reflection Gabriel experienced a brief vision, without defined images but with intense emotion, hands clasped tightly, a vow made in dim light, the metallic taste of fear, the scent of candles. And the phrase that surfaced in his mind didn't come as a thought of his own, but as a memory. It was forbidden to return. His chest tightened sharply. He didn't know why that idea existed, but he felt its meaning as if it were a truth written into his body. Forbidden to return, forbidden to enter, forbidden to remember. And yet, he was there. The mansion, as if it had heard that truth, released a long, drawn-out creak from somewhere above, coming from the upper floor. It didn't sound like wood settling under weight. It sounded like a door being pushed open slowly, deliberately. Gabriel turned his head toward the sound and noticed something new. The corridor they had come from seemed longer than it had been just seconds earlier. The walls appeared to have pulled apart. The space had grown, as if the house were rearranging itself to accommodate a return. Reality, inside that place, was not fixed. A smooth wall now occupied the exact spot where a door had been moments before. Gabriel approached slowly, as if a sudden movement might tear apart whatever scraps of normality still remained. He ran his fingers along the cold surface and realized it wasn't an illusion. It was continuous wood. No crack, no frame, no hidden handle. The mansion had rearranged space with the cruel naturalness of something that does not need to explain itself. The shock didn't arrive as immediate panic. It came as a slow disbelief, a desperate attempt to find logic. Gabriel stepped back once, then again, scanning the corners, the ceiling, the floor. No signs of recent construction, nothing suggesting a trick, just altered reality, as if the house were capable of editing its own floor plan. A quick heat rose in his chest, a physiological reflex of alert. His breathing shortened, and yet instead of the urge to run, something more complex emerged, a kind of instinctive acceptance. The mansion didn't seem hostile, it seemed determined, as if it were guiding him. The woman stood near the window, and Gabriel realized she showed no surprise at the wall. No startle, no look of shock. Her serenity in the face of the impossible struck him silently. This was normal for her. Or worse, it was expected. Gabriel ran a hand over his face, trying to wake from a dream that wasn't a dream. The memory of the brooch, the brief vision, the forbidden to return phrase blended into the present, and the line between memory and imagination grew thinner. The mansion seemed to exploit that fragility, pushing him into a state where questioning reality became pointless. In the living room, the air felt warmer now, or perhaps it was just the presence of that body displaced from time. The scent of dried flowers intensified, as if the room were breathing through the vase. Gabriel approached the table and touched the glass. The water inside, still there, rippled slightly, as if stirred by an invisible movement. That was when he noticed something he hadn't before, fingerprints along the side of the vase, recent marks, as if someone had held it not long ago. The fine dust around it was faintly disturbed, indicating objects there were being touched. The mansion was not abandoned. It was inhabited in another way. Gabriel tried to anchor his mind in facts. Someone might be maintaining the property, a hired caretaker, a groundskeeper. But that reasoning collapsed in the face of the wall that had replaced a door. No ordinary human reshapes a house at will. The sound upstairs returned, clearer now. A sequence of cracks like slow, measured footsteps crossing the ceiling. The weight of those steps felt too heavy to be wood settling. Gabriel felt his body tense. The woman, however, didn't move to flee. Her posture suggested the footsteps were not new. There was an old resignation in the way she remained still, as if that sound were part of a routine of waiting. And yet, Gabriel sensed something else in her, something clearer now, a vigilant care, as if she were attentive not to the sound itself but to the effect it would have on him. Love at that point was still a dangerous word. Gabriel could barely admit the idea that what he felt might be love, but the sensation inside him wasn't just attraction or fascination. It was a bond that had existed before their first visual contact, as if his heart had recognized an absence and, upon seeing her again, had decided to beat differently. He studied her face more closely. Her features were delicate, but there was firmness there, a quiet dignity. And there was also a sadness that seemed to have existed far too long. Gabriel realized that sadness wasn't hers alone. It felt shared, belonging to both of them, tied to something that had happened and was still happening. The mansion creaked again, and this time a metallic sound mixed with it, like a key turning in a distant lock. Gabriel felt a chill in his stomach. If locks were being engaged, then doors were being secured. The house was choosing what to allow. He crossed the room searching for another exit. He found a second door on the opposite side, but when he tried to open it, he realized it was far too heavy. It didn't feel locked by any ordinary key. It felt sealed by weight, as if the wood itself had grown denser. Gabriel braced his shoulder and pushed. The door didn't give an inch. The effort left him breathless, frustration pounding in his temples. When he stepped back, he noticed the air around the door carried a different cold, concentrated, warning, as if the barrier itself were exhaling a message. The mansion did not want him to pass that way. The sound upstairs stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of a predator that stops moving because it has decided to listen. Gabriel looked back at the woman, searching for an explanation that couldn't come in words. Her gaze offered something else instead, a kind of request. Not a request for him to escape, a request for him to trust. Trust felt insane. And yet the alternative was fighting walls that moved and doors that turned to stone. Gabriel realized that by entering the mansion, he had already taken the first step of a pact. A silent pact with a place that recognizes and binds, a pact that demands participation. He moved to the window and looked outside, at the tree-lined drive, at the iron gate in the distance. The distance felt greater than it should have. The path looked longer, more winding, as if the mansion were stretching the outside world to make returning harder. And in that moment, Gabriel felt something even more unsettling. It wasn't just the house that was changing. It was him. A thought that wasn't his crossed his mind clear as a written sentence. Now that you've returned, you can't leave without finishing. His chest tightened. The mansion seemed to have a voice without speaking. The envelope looked newly placed, yet nothing in the room suggested movement. No draft that could have carried it. No sound of footsteps, no tremor of furniture. It was simply there, as if the mansion had decided to materialize a piece on the board. Gabriel approached slowly, his heart beating in an irregular rhythm between fear and anticipation. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges but not fragile. Old quality paper made to last, like letters that cross oceans and wars. In the corner, the handwriting was elegant and deliberate, as if each letter had been drawn with intention. Gabriel Aurelio Soares, his full name. A cold shock hit his stomach. Very few people called him by his full name. He himself rarely wrote it, and yet there it was, in dark ink almost untouched by time. The woman remained near the window, motionless, but Gabriel sensed her absolute attention, as if the envelope were a point of danger. The mansion seemed quieter, as if respecting the act of opening, as if everything were waiting for the same thing, the moment when the past would finally touch the present irreversibly. Gabriel picked up the envelope. It was cold to the touch, but not a natural cold. It was the cold of something stored alongside absences. The seal wasn't wax, but an embossed stamp pressed into the paper, a flower design similar to her brooch, the same motif, the same signature. The seal gave way easily, as if it wanted to be broken. Gabriel opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a sheet folded into 4 parts, written on both sides. The ink wasn't smudged. There were no signs of moisture. It was as if the letter had been written yesterday, and yet every curve of the handwriting carried an impossible antiquity. He began to read. The words didn't enter his mind like ordinary reading. They entered like memory. Before fully grasping the meaning, Gabriel felt the emotional impact, as if the paper were charged with energy, as if the writing itself had been designed to provoke return, not understanding. The letter spoke of a long wait. It spoke of a house sealed out of necessity. It spoke of a love that had to be protected, even against the will of the one who loved. It spoke of a promise of return, not voluntary but inevitable. One phrase repeated itself in different forms like a silent refrain. The mansion recognizes before it opens. Gabriel swallowed hard as he realized the letter mentioned details too intimate to be invention. It referenced the specific scent of white flowers in the hall. It mentioned a chandelier that should not be lit until the right moment. It mentioned the side corridor that does not reveal itself to those who do not belong. Every detail was so precise it felt like a description of what he had just lived. And then, in the middle of the text, a line shattered any attempt at rationality. When you read this, you will know that you have already found me, even without remembering me. Gabriel's entire body reacted. His hands trembled, his throat tightened. It wasn't just the content. It was the way the words seemed to speak directly to a place inside him, unreachable by ordinary thought. The letter, without dialogue, carried a presence. A written voice, firm and sad, like someone who knows they will be forgotten, and writes to defeat forgetting. The text spoke of her with absolute care, describing her patience, her fragility, her quiet strength, and it spoke of Gabriel as someone who needed to return whole so the cycle could be completed. Cycle. The word rang in Gabriel's mind like a bell. He felt its weight in his body, as if his body already knew the cycle, as if it had already gone through it before. Fear changed shape then. It was no longer fear of the house or the woman. It became fear of himself, fear that he had already done something there at some point and that he was merely repeating it. The mansion creaked upstairs in response, one isolated crack, then another, like wood pressed by slow footsteps. Gabriel lifted his head, but the sound stopped again. The house seemed to toy with his attention, keeping him suspended between present and premonition. Gabriel kept reading. The letter spoke of a door that should not be opened before he had remembered enough. It spoke of a place within the mansion where time does not behave like time. It spoke of one object kept and another missing. And finally, there was a warning. If you try to leave before understanding, the mansion will stop you. Not out of cruelty, but because it was made for this. It keeps, it holds, it finishes what it begins. Gabriel stopped. The paper felt heavier. The air in the room felt thicker. A wave of vertigo hit him, and he had to brace himself against the back of the sofa. The woman, still silent, seemed to follow his internal rhythm. Gabriel realized something with painful clarity. She wasn't just part of the mystery. She was the reason. She was the promise. And the mansion was the instrument of waiting. The romance, even without obvious gestures, began to take on tangible form. Gabriel felt tenderness toward her, as if that tenderness had been stored away for a long time, and that tenderness came with a sense of guilt he couldn't explain. How could one love someone and, at the same time, feel indebted to them? There was one more folded page. Gabriel unfolded it, and then he saw something worse than words, a small strand of hair tucked into the paper by an old fold. A dark, fine strand, preserved like a relic. Gabriel felt a deep shiver, as if his body recognized the material. He lifted his eyes involuntarily to her hair. The color was the same. The strand on the paper seemed to belong to her, and at the same time seemed to have been kept before she could possibly be alive now. Time, there, had claws. The flicker of the chandelier did not bring real light. It was only a brief, almost timid flash, but enough to change the density of the air. Gabriel felt as if that flicker had been a signal, not to illuminate the room, but to mark a point in time. As if the mansion had recorded it, he read. He touched the past. He accepted the first step. The sound from the adjacent wall lingered for a moment, a low scraping, like a nail against wood or fabric dragged slowly. Gabriel moved closer, tilting his head, trying to locate it, but the sound stopped suddenly, as if interrupted by a decision. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. He realized the house was using sound as language, choosing when to speak and when to fall silent. The intimate room seemed smaller, or perhaps Gabriel was larger inside now, as if memories were beginning to take up space. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and noticed something unsettling. The air was warmer now, as if the house had adjusted the temperature to his emotional state. It was a damp, almost human warmth, like accumulated breath. Gabriel returned to the place where the door had vanished, more out of insistence than hope. The wall remained smooth, non-negotiable. He pressed his palm against the wood and felt a faint vibration. It wasn't electrical. It was the vibration of something alive, something that responds. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if he had touched the fevered skin of someone. His instinct screamed for another exit, but the letter echoed, "The mansion will stop you, not out of cruelty. Because it was made for this." Made. The word opened a terrifying possibility. Made by whom? For what? Gabriel had always treated buildings as inert things, products of architecture and material. But here the mansion felt like a mechanism, an object with a function, an instrument designed to keep and to finish. The chandelier flickered again, this time deep in the hall. Out of sight, but perceptible through a weak reflection of light crossing the corridor. The light traveled through the house like a pulse, a brief wave. Gabriel felt his scalp prickle. The mansion was turning itself on and off like a heart testing its own beat. The woman finally moved toward the corridor. Not in a hurry, but with the naturalness of someone who doesn't ask a place for permission to walk through it. She didn't look to Gabriel for approval. And yet, He felt she was leading. Her path was a direction. His body followed before his mind decided. As they crossed the corridor, Gabriel noticed subtle changes in the house. The scent of flowers seemed more dispersed, as if coming from multiple points. The temperature shifted in waves, one stretch colder, another warmer. It felt like walking through different layers of time, each with its own climate. At one point, the cold was so intense that his arm hair stood on end. 2 steps later, the air turned almost hot, as if someone had just stepped out of a bath and left steam behind. The house was adjusting its climate the way one adjusts emotion. They reached the hall again, or at least what appeared to be the hall. Gabriel stopped, unsettled. The space was similar, but there were details that hadn't been there before. A small table near the staircase with a darkened silver tray, a tall vase in the corner, and at the center of the floor, a circular patch of light coming from nowhere, as if an invisible window were projecting sunlight. Gabriel looked up. The ceiling was the same. The chandelier was off. There was no opening. And yet, the patch of light existed, steady, insistent, like an invitation. He stepped closer and noticed that within the circle, dust was less accumulated, as if someone had cleaned that specific spot, as if the mansion were saying, "Step here." He hesitated. His entire body rejected and desired it at the same time. Then he stepped into it. The effect was immediate and subtle. There was no fall, no sound, but the air changed around him. The sense of distance from the outside world increased. Gabriel had the impression that if he looked back, he would see the corridor stretch again, the door vanish once more, the path become impossible. It was as if that spot on the floor were a key. The woman remained near the staircase, and Gabriel noticed that her gaze, though sad, carried something like approval, not light approval. Approval with weight, as if this were a necessary step in an ancient sequence. The upper floor seemed to call, not with a voice, but with absence, a dark space that pulls. Gabriel felt something click inside his head, as if a memory were trying to lock into place. For a moment he saw the staircase lit by candles, people dressed from another era, the sound of fabric brushing against the steps. He smelled warm wax and fear. The image vanished, leaving his heart racing. At the top of the staircase, there was a door Gabriel hadn't noticed before. A dark door, unadorned, with a frame far too plain for a mansion so ornate. It looked out of place, like it had been installed later, or as if it had always been invisible until the right moment. Gabriel blinked, trying to confirm it wasn't his imagination. The door stayed there, and above it, on the wall, there was a lighter mark in the paint, as if something had hung there for decades and been removed recently. The mansion creaked again, this time continuously, like a long sigh rising from inside the beams. The temperature dropped 2 degrees at once, and Gabriel felt a cold that didn't come from the air but from meaning. The door at the top felt like the next step. The letter had spoken of a door that shouldn't be opened before he remembered enough. Gabriel didn't know if he had remembered enough, but he knew the mansion wouldn't stop pushing until he tried. The woman began to climb slowly. Gabriel noticed a terrible detail. Her steps made no sound, no creak, no crack, like she didn't have enough weight to disturb the wood. That wasn't natural, and yet Gabriel followed her as if it were the most inevitable thing in the world. The sight of his own body standing still in the circle of light didn't hit like a sudden fright. It came as a slow fracture in trust, as if Gabriel were watching a flaw in a mirror that insisted on being perfect. Down in the hall there was a figure that was him, same posture, arms loose, head slightly tilted, but too motionless, too rigid, as if frozen in a second just before. Gabriel felt his stomach clamp violently. The air seemed to thin. The sensation wasn't just fear, it was existential disorientation, as if the world had lost one of its most basic laws, that a body can only occupy one place at a time. He blinked, waiting for the reflection to vanish. The figure remained. The light in the circle looked whiter now, more defined, and the dust around it, paradoxically, seemed to spin in a spiral as if being drawn toward that point. The image of the other Gabriel didn't follow the real Gabriel's movements. It was a delayed version, trapped in a pause, as if the mansion had captured a fragment of presence and kept it there. The woman kept climbing ahead, silent as ever, and Gabriel realized she hadn't stopped, hadn't shown surprise, hadn't offered any sign that this was extraordinary. Her normality in the face of the impossible sharpened his dread. This was part of the mansion's internal rules. And if it was part of the rules, then he was stepping into a system that already knew his footsteps. Gabriel forced his gaze upward, refusing to let the hall pull him in. The railing beneath his hand was cold and smooth, and the wood, despite its age, felt solid, as if reinforced from within. It smelled of old varnish, dust, and something faintly sweet, like wood that had absorbed perfume for decades. Each step gave a soft creak, but the sound came a beat late, as if it had to pass through invisible water before reaching his ears. Gabriel realized the delay wasn't only in sound, it was in his body too. His movements carried a microscopic slowness, as if the space around him resisted with a kind of viscosity. That was why, maybe, the version of him downstairs existed. Time, here, didn't flow as a single stream. It folded, split, left residue behind. On the upper landing, the air was colder. The temperature dropped the way it does when you dive deeper into a lake. The walls were covered in old wallpaper with faded floral patterns, and the smell was stronger, faint mildew, sealed fabric, and something mineral, like damp stone. Gabriel felt his skin prickle. The dark door waited at the end of the corridor. It was too simple, and that simplicity felt deliberate, as if ornament couldn't fit behind it, as if whatever was there required only function. Gabriel walked toward the door with careful steps, but his mind stayed hooked on the image in the hall. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left part of himself behind, as if the delayed body was a guarantee that if something went wrong, the mansion would have a mold of him stored away, ready to use. The woman stopped in front of the door, and Gabriel noticed the slight tilt of her body, not from fatigue, but from attention, like someone approaching a known boundary. The atmosphere around the door was different. The air felt drier, stiller, as if it didn't circulate. A concentrated silence gathered there, like dust in a corner no one ever cleans. Gabriel reached out to touch the non-existent handle. That's when he saw it. There was no handle. The door was smooth, with only a thin line indicating where it opened. A door with no explicit invitation, like it demanded a different kind of access. He placed his palm against the wood. The wood was warm. Not just warm like the front door had been, warm like skin. Gabriel felt a shock run up his entire arm, a shiver climbing to the base of his skull. The mansion at that point seemed to have nerves, and then the memory came. Not a complete image, but a smell and a sensation so strong it nearly knocked him over. Hot wax, iron, the dampness of tears drying on his face. The weight of an old ring being turned on a finger. Hands trembling while doing something that shouldn't be done. A promise made without words. A promise carved into will, not speech. Gabriel stepped back with an involuntary exhale. The corridor seemed to narrow for an instant, as if reacting to hesitation. The wallpaper snapped softly, and the floorboards answered with a long groan, as if the entire place disapproved of retreat. He looked over his shoulder, at the landing, at the stairs. The staircase seemed longer than before, and the hall below was partially hidden by shadows that hadn't been there minutes ago. Gabriel could no longer see the circle of light, as if the mansion had decided to hide the proof after showing it. The woman, still silent, moved as if carrying an invisible weight. Gabriel understood with painful clarity that she wasn't there to lure him out of curiosity. She was there because she needed him to reach a specific point. She needed him to remember enough to do something she couldn't do alone. At that moment, the romance became something dangerous. It wasn't just tenderness or fascination. It was the feeling of responsibility for someone suffering because of something he might have started. Gabriel felt his chest tighten with guilt that had no origin, a guilt his body recognized but his mind couldn't explain. A sharp knock echoed from inside the door, not like wood settling, like something hitting the door from within. Gabriel froze. The hair on his arms rose. The sound came with a sudden cold, like a breath slipping through a crack. The entire house seemed to listen. Even the smaller noises stopped. Gabriel realized that whatever was behind that door wasn't just a room or a corridor. It was a region of the mansion that didn't reveal itself before the right moment. A sealed lair, the place where the cycle truly began. He put his hand on the door again, and this time he didn't retreat. The wood vibrated under his palm, as if recognizing the contact. The line in the wood widened slowly. No hinge noise, none of the usual complaint of old doors. The opening didn't feel like a mechanical result, but consent, as if the door wasn't being pushed, but persuaded. The air that escaped carried a deeper cold than anything Gabriel had felt since arriving. A cold that wasn't merely the absence of warmth, but the absence of time. The smell was unmistakable: melted wax, damp stone, oxidized iron, and something older, almost mineral, like soil that never sees sunlight. Gabriel's body responded with an involuntary tremor. Not immediate fear, but bodily recognition. This wasn't new. This was reunion. The space beyond the door wasn't a normal room. It was a narrow corridor, lower than the rest of the mansion, as if it had been carved into it after the original construction. The walls weren't wood, but irregular stone, cold to the touch, marked with grooves that didn't look like the work of time, but of pressure. like something had been shoved again and again against those surfaces. The light inside didn't come from bulbs or windows. It came from old candles set into niches in the wall. Many melted down to the base, others still intact, but all unlit. And yet the corridor wasn't completely dark. There was a faint milky glow, as if the air itself emitted leftover light, the memory of fire that had existed there for far too long. Gabriel took his first step inside and felt an immediate change in his body. The weight felt heavier, as if gravity had been adjusted. His breathing slowed, not by choice, but necessity. The space demanded its own rhythm. Behind him, the door closed without a sound. There was no thud, no audible lock, only the sudden certainty that going back was not available at that moment. Gabriel swallowed, heart pounding. The mansion had now decided to isolate him from the rest of the world in a more final way. The woman entered right after, crossing the threshold with the same silent naturalness. Gabriel felt a chill as he noticed that inside this place she seemed sharper, no longer defined only by shadow and suggestion, but by concrete presence. Her dress looked less ethereal, the outline of her body more solid. Still, her footsteps made no sound. The corridor seemed to stretch farther than it should. Every 10 steps, Gabriel felt as if he'd walked much more. Time in there felt compressed and extended at once. The dripping water he'd heard when the door opened continued, rhythmic, coming from somewhere ahead. Each drop sounded like a marker, a counter for something approaching. The walls showed strange marks, symbols pressed into the stone, not as clear inscriptions but as impressions, as if human hands had pushed into the rock while it was still pliable. Some resembled incomplete circles, others crossed lines, and there were marks that looked like simple fingerprints, elongated by time. A cold ran along Gabriel's spine when he realized some of those marks were at the height of his own body, as if made by someone of similar build. A fragmented memory flashed through his mind, hands pressed to a cold wall, body leaning forward, breath ragged, fear mixed with determination. The image vanished as quickly as it came, but the emotional impact remained intact. The corridor ended in a circular space, a kind of chamber built in the heart of the mansion. The ceiling was low, supported by darkened stone beams, and the floor was uneven, marked by old stains Gabriel didn't want to identify too precisely. In the center, there was a low stone structure, not exactly an altar, but something that had been used repeatedly with ritual intention. The dripping water came from a crack in the ceiling, falling into a small metal vessel on the floor. The drip was slow, regular, like a primitive clock. Gabriel felt that sound was marking not ordinary time, but the time of waiting. The woman's presence intensified there, not as a threat, but as concentrated ancient pain. Gabriel felt a deep pressure in his chest, a sadness that wasn't just empathy, but shared ownership, as if that place amplified emotion until it became common property to everyone inside it. Then he noticed something disturbing. The chamber didn't feel empty. There was weight in the air, a sense of occupancy, not many presences, but one single dense contained thing, something that didn't move but pressed. Gabriel understood without needing explanation that this was one of the points where the mansion learned to wait, where something had been placed to remain until certain conditions were met, where love had been transformed into containment. The cold suddenly intensified, and the air seemed to vibrate. The water dripped once, harder, splashing slightly. Gabriel felt his entire body react, as if something had recognized his presence inside. He wasn't just visiting a hidden space, he was being measured. And in that moment it became clear this wasn't the only chamber. There were others, scattered throughout the mansion, each one guarding a fragment of something that never should have been divided. The weight in his pocket wasn't subtle. It was as if a metal object had been placed there firmly, without ceremony, and the mere possibility made Gabriel's skin prickle. He brought a hand to his pocket cautiously, afraid he'd find something impossible, and he did. His fingers touched a cold, smooth surface with finely worked edges. He drew the object out slowly, like pulling something from a wounded body, afraid of causing pain. When the metal appeared in the chamber's milky light, Gabriel felt his blood go cold. It was a brooch, identical to the brooch on the woman's dress. The same stylized flower, the same pale stone at the center, the same delicate frame of branches, only this one looked older, more worn along the edges, as if it had been handled and squeezed many times by restless fingers. And yet the stone shone with an almost recent clarity, as if light had been stored inside it. Gabriel looked at the brooch in his hand, then at the brooch pinned to her dress. Two identical pieces, as if the existence of one required the existence of the other. The duplication didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a mechanism, a pair. The chamber reacted almost imperceptibly. The rhythm of the dripping water shifted for an instant. One drop fell out of time, as if the place had been disturbed. The air grew colder, and Gabriel felt a faint buzzing in his ears, like subterranean pressure. He stepped closer to the circular recess in the stone. The fit was perfect, too exact to be chance. The mansion had been built or altered to receive that object. Gabriel felt the impulse to set the brooch into the recess, as if the gesture were programmed inside him. But along with the impulse came fear. What if it triggered something that couldn't be undone? The woman remained still, watching with that sad gaze that seemed to cut through time. Gabriel felt a silent warning in her, not in words but emotion. Hope and dread braided together, like someone who needs something to happen but fears the cost. Gabriel gripped the brooch tighter, feeling the metal bite into his skin. The touch brought a quick wave of memory, the sensation of pinning the brooch to dark fabric, hands trembling, breath short, the sound of rain outside. The memory came with a sentence that wasn't spoken but understood. "This will keep you here." He took a deep breath, trying not to be dragged under by the fragment. The recess in the altar seemed to pull the object like a magnet. Gabriel leaned in and slowly brought the brooch toward the slot. The moment the central stone came within a few inches of the surface, the chamber changed. The milky glow intensified, as if the air itself brightened. The dripping stopped completely, as if someone had sealed the crack in the ceiling. Silence became absolute, so thick Gabriel almost felt pressure on his chest. And then for a second, time hesitated. Gabriel felt it not as a thought but as a bodily interruption. His heartbeat seemed to miss a beat, his breathing suspended, his entire body fell into a state of pause. The mansion was waiting for the final gesture, waiting for the completion of the fit. Gabriel's hand trembled. The brooch nearly touched stone. He pulled back, air moved again, and the dripping resumed slowly, as if someone restarted the rhythm of a clock. The mansion seemed to accept the retreat, but not without recording it. Gabriel shivered as if he'd heard a not yet coming from the walls. He took a step back, keeping the brooch in his hand. The chamber seemed darker now, as if the light had been loaned and then withdrawn. Gabriel looked around and noticed something else. The stains on the floor weren't random. They formed an incomplete circle around the central structure, as if someone had drawn a boundary with some substance time had darkened. Incomplete circle. Gabriel felt a chill at the back of his neck. The letter had talked about a cycle. The chamber seemed to be part of it, a cycle that only closes when the right object is placed in the right spot. He tried to examine the brooch with a practical mind, looking for markings, inscriptions. He turned it over and saw something engraved on the back, nearly worn away, a double initial intertwined. G&L Gabriel and another name his mind still couldn't reach. When the woman saw the initials, she seemed to carry a sharper pain. Gabriel felt that pain as if it were his. The connection between them, silent, intense, was becoming less romantic in the ordinary sense and more inevitable, as if the romance were a consequence of something deeper, destiny, a promise, a mistake. The drip of water changed tone. The drop began to fall with a more metallic sound, as if the container were filling beyond what it should. Gabriel looked and realized the vessel on the floor was dry, and yet the sound suggested pooled water. The sound didn't match reality. The place was beginning to distort perception. Gabriel felt pressure in his chest as if something inside him wanted out. He gripped the brooch hard and realized the metal seemed to be warming in his hand. The heat rose slowly until the central stone was warm, almost hot. The brooch was responding to his body, or his body was responding to the brooch. The distinction no longer mattered. They were part of the same circuit. The dark dust on Gabriel's hands didn't behave like ordinary grime. It didn't fall immediately when he opened his fingers. It clung for a few seconds, drawn to his skin as if attracted by heat, by pulse, by life. Instinctively, Gabriel rubbed one hand against the other, and the dust dispersed into the air in fine particles that didn't sink right away. They hung there, turning slowly, like ash in a windless room. His heart accelerated. That wasn't coming from the chamber, not from the floor or the walls. It was coming from him. The realization triggered sudden nausea, a brief vertigo that forced him to brace a hand against the stone structure. Contact with the altar brought another wave, a memory without images, only emotional weight, the feeling of holding something precious while accepting it must be left behind, a gesture that hurts more than losing something by outside force. The brooch, still in his hand, pulsed with uneven warmth. It didn't burn, but it felt alive. Gabriel had the absurd impression that if he closed his eyes, he'd feel it beating like a small heart. He opened his fingers and stared at the pale stone in the center. For a second, the glow looked sharper, as if something were arranging itself inside. The woman approached slowly. For the first time since she'd entered the chamber, she reduced the distance in a clear, deliberate way. Gabriel felt his chest tighten, because that approach wasn't only physical. There was a silent decision in her, like someone who understands she can no longer remain only an observer. She stopped a few steps away, and Gabriel felt something shift in the air. It wasn't electricity or wind. It was emotional density. Her presence so close intensified everything. The weight of the chamber, the meaning of the brooch, the urgency of the choice. Then Gabriel noticed a detail he'd missed before. Her eyes didn't reflect the chamber's milky light the same way his did. There was a tiny delay, almost imperceptible, as if the light touched the space around her first and only then reached her eyes. It wasn't a lack of reflection. It was a difference in time. She wasn't exactly in the same now. That realization brought a sudden, profound sadness. Gabriel felt that no matter how present she seemed, something in her was always one step ahead or behind, caught at a different point on the timeline. The mansion wasn't keeping her there completely. It was keeping a version, an echo, an incomplete persistence. A name began to form in Gabriel's mind, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He felt the shape of it, the rhythm, the emotion attached to it. He knew it started with L. He knew it sounded soft. He knew saying it would have consequences. The name pressed from the inside, like a key that couldn't be used before its time. The initials engraved on the brooch, G and L, burned in his mind. Gabriel tried to speak, but no sound came out. His throat closed, not from physical blockage, but imposed restraint. The mansion wouldn't allow that name to be spoken yet. The sound died before it existed. Gabriel shuddered. The house didn't only reorganize space and time, it regulated revelations. The dripping from the ceiling stopped again. The metal vessel on the floor began to vibrate faintly, producing a low, continuous tone, almost like a distant chant. The vibration spread through the chamber, up the walls, through the floor, reaching Gabriel's feet like a slow pulse. He felt his body respond. His heartbeat adjusted. His breathing deepened. Something inside him was being prepared. The dark dust kept appearing in small amounts whenever he clenched his fist, as if memory were breaking down into ash so it could be rearranged. Gabriel realized those particles had the same dark hue as the stains on the chamber floor. The conclusion struck like a blow. It was residue from the ritual, fragments of what had been done there before. He was leaking the past. The woman raised a hand slowly and touched the center of her own chest. The gesture wasn't theatrical. It was almost automatic, like someone touching a place that hurts when time shifts. Gabriel felt the same pressure in the same spot in his own body. The synchronization wasn't symbolic. It was real. The brooch vibrated harder. Gabriel felt the temptation to set it into the altar grow almost unbearable. The motion promised immediate relief, promised quiet, promised to stabilize the house, to silence the sounds, stop the visions. The old promise, always the same: if you do this, everything goes still again. But something in him resisted, not resistance to the ritual itself, but to repetition. The déjà vu intensified, accompanied by a disturbing conviction. He had done this before. He had set the brooch in place. He had completed the circle. He had believed it was the right thing. And the result was here, standing in front of him, in this woman who existed between times, in this mansion that could neither die nor live. The metal vessel on the floor began to crack with a dry sound. A fissure ran through the metal like a vein. The dripping returned, but faster now, irregular. The chamber was losing stability. The house wasn't only waiting for choices, it was reacting to the memory of them. Gabriel felt his whole body heat up, as if a fever were starting. The brooch became too hot to hold comfortably, but he didn't let go. The name pressed harder, trying to rise. He closed his eyes for a moment and finally saw a more complete image. Himself, younger, in that same chamber, holding the brooch with decisive hands. The woman in front of him, more alive, more solid. The circle on the floor complete. The vow made in silence. The arrogant certainty that love justified everything. The image broke before the end. Gabriel opened his eyes with a short exhale. He still didn't remember everything, but he remembered enough to know this wasn't the last chamber. This was only the first part of the mistake. The sound was coming from below. But below wasn't a simple direction in that mansion. Gabriel felt the dragging travel through layers, as if moving inside the walls, behind the stone, through the wood, finding paths that didn't exist on the world's map. It was continuous, heavy, like something too big to carry and too slow to be only wind. The chamber answered with a brief tremor, not the tremor of collapse, but of an organism, as if the mansion had muscles, and those muscles were contracting. The vibration climbed through Gabriel's feet and lodged in his chest, making his heart beat irregularly. He tightened his grip on the brooch and felt the central stone pulse with heat, as if responding to the sound. The woman didn't move, but her expression changed. Her ancient sadness sharpened, as if fear had surfaced underneath. Not panic, recognition. She knew what that sound meant, and that silent certainty gave shape to Gabriel's terror. If she recognized it, then it had already happened. The irregular dripping from the ceiling sped up for a few seconds, then stopped entirely, as if the place were holding its breath. The invisible water on the floor, water that didn't wet, yet seemed to occupy space, began to move in small flows, like a slow tide. Gabriel watched and realized the water was sliding toward the center of the chamber, drawn to the altar, obeying some unseen field. The dragging grew closer, not only louder but more textured. Gabriel began to distinguish a second element in the sound, a sharp scrape, like metal grinding against stone. The idea of something metallic, heavy, restrained, being pulled by an invisible force formed images in his mind he didn't want to create. The chambers seemed to tighten around them. The walls, though unmoving, fell closer. The milky light dimmed, the air grew colder, and now the cold wasn't coming from the place, it was coming from threat. Gabriel realized the mansion wasn't only a vault, it was a containment mechanism. And containment mechanisms always share the same problem. When something tries to escape, the mechanism responds. He looked back, searching for the door they'd come through. It was there, but it felt farther away, as if the corridor had lengthened. Space was reorganizing again to make retreat harder, not out of cruelty but function. To keep something, you have to prevent exit. The dragging now seemed to circle. It wasn't coming from just one direction, as if something moved through internal tunnels, testing walls, searching for the right place to emerge. Gabriel felt fear turn into a metallic taste in his mouth, like blood before it appears. He realized he was holding the brooch like a weapon, but he knew it wasn't a weapon. It was a key, and keys open things that should stay closed. The woman stepped sideways, closer to the altar. She didn't touch the stone, but her movement changed the air. Gabriel felt a wave of emotion pass through him, a desperate decision, like someone choosing between two evils, knowing any choice will wound. The house creaked above them as if answering. One long groan followed by the sound of wood under pressure, and for an instant Gabriel had a brief vision of the hall. Not the hall as it was now, but the hall in the past, candles burning, people standing in silence, and at the top of the stairs that handleless door opening on its own. The vision vanished, but it left behind the sense that the present was being invaded by older layers. Gabriel realized with growing clarity that the dragging wasn't simply a frightening sound, it was a consequence. Something was responding to the fact that he was getting closer to memory. And whatever was responding didn't want him to remember the right way. Or maybe it did, but it wanted to charge him for it. The broken metal vessel on the floor vibrated again, and the cracks spread. Inside the metal there wasn't water. There was a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light around it. Gabriel leaned closer despite his instincts screaming not to, and saw that the fissure looked like a small well. Not a physical well, but a tear. The air around it was colder, as if that darkness were breathing. The dragging answered, closer now, and Gabriel felt it in his body, an involuntary tremor in his legs, a sudden prickle across his scalp. The mansion was no longer just a place that kept things. It was a place that noticed, and noticing it could decide. The idea that the house could hunt sounded absurd, but the sensation was exactly that. Space wasn't neutral. It moved with purpose. It rearranged paths. It revealed and concealed. Gabriel gripped the brooch and for the first time felt something like an outside will pass through his hand. Not physical force, an internal tilt, as if the object wanted to go to the altar, wanted to lock into place, wanted to complete the circle, wanted to calm the room. The impulse was seductive because it promised stability, but Gabriel remembered the woman, the tiny delay in the way light reached her eyes, the sadness that had lived in her for too long, and he understood. The stability bought by that gesture was imprisonment. It was the same solution that had already been tried, the same fix that created the in-between state where she existed now. He couldn't repeat it. The dragging came so close Gabriel felt vibration in the stone under his feet, the sound of something heavy being pulled to the edge of a boundary, then an impact, a dull thud, like something striking an internal wall. The milky light flickered, not like the chandelier but like the air itself losing cohesion. For an instant the chamber went too dark, and in that darkness Gabriel noticed the kind of detail you only catch when sight fails. The smell of something old and alive. Not mildew, not wax, something animal, mineral, wet, like flesh kept outside of time. Gabriel gagged with nausea. The mansion wasn't holding only love and promises, it was holding a consequence that smelled like something that should not exist. The woman moved closer to the altar, and Gabriel sensed she was trying to protect him from whatever was moving. But protection there wasn't a physical barrier, it was guidance, it was leading. The dragging stopped abruptly, and the silence afterward was so absolute Gabriel could hear his own blood. The chain didn't come out of the fissure all at once. First one link appeared, then another, grinding softly, like metal waking after decades submerged in silence. The sound wasn't only heard, it vibrated in Gabriel's chest as if each dragged link produced an internal response, a deep echo in his body. The chain looked too heavy to move on its own, and yet it advanced with unmistakable intent. Gabriel stepped back, his heel catching on the uneven edge of stone. His heart hammered, and the brooch in his hand answered with a sudden heat, almost painful. The central stone shone brighter, scattering the chamber's milky light into irregular fragments that danced across the walls. The mansion seemed to split its attention between two poles, the advancing chain and the object Gabriel held. The woman moved quickly, not with ordinary human speed, but with a strange fluidity, as if she slid through space. She placed herself between Gabriel and the chain, and in that instant the air changed again. Gabriel felt an invisible resistance form, as if the space had grown denser at that specific point. The chain shuddered, stopping for a second, its links vibrating like tensed muscles. The silence that followed was brief. The chain moved again, slower now, as if testing limits. It wasn't attacking chaotically. It advanced with patience, choosing its path, adjusting its angle. Gabriel felt a cold shiver. That wasn't an automatic mechanism. It was an adaptive containment system. The house learned from resistance. Small fissures began to appear in the chamber floor, as if internal pressure were being redistributed. The dripping, previously stopped, returned in multiple places, not focused on a single vessel anymore. The sound now came from every direction, creating an irregular rhythm that scrambled any sense of where it was coming from. The mansion was losing the silent elegance of waiting and taking on the brutal, functional urgency of containment. Gabriel felt his body enter total alert, every sense sharpened. He heard his own blood, smelled the chain's metallic tang, noticed tiny shifts in temperature from one spot of the chamber to another. Fear didn't paralyze him, it kept him present, awake. And beneath the fear, there was something else, understanding. The chain wasn't there to hurt, it was there to prevent, to keep, to ensure the cycle wouldn't be interrupted the wrong way. The woman turned her face toward Gabriel, and he felt in her an urgency unlike anything he'd experienced so far. It wasn't a plea, and it wasn't a warning. It was something harsher, imminent resolve. She knew the chamber wasn't the final boundary. This was only the first physical mechanism in a much larger system. Gabriel understood, his chest tightening, that the mansion was reacting because he hadn't set the brooch into the altar. The house interpreted his hesitation as a containment failure, and when containment fails, the system shifts into corrective mode. The chain advanced a little farther, scraping stone, throwing off tiny, weak sparks that died before they reached the floor. Gabriel felt the urge to run, but realized there was nowhere to go. The return corridor seemed too far, and the door, though still visible, radiated the sense of imminent closure. The brooch burned now, not like fire, but like fever. Gabriel felt his palms sweat, and a fresh wave of dark dust rose between his fingers, dissolving into the air like smoke. Memory was burning itself down so it could rearrange. He looked again at the recess in the altar. The slot seemed deeper now, more defined, as if the stone had adapted to the object's absence. The temptation to solve everything with one simple gesture grew until it nearly hurt. Set it in, complete it, silence it. But something inside him screamed that this wasn't the right ending, that the cycle didn't need reinforcing, it needed breaking, and breaking something there would require more than putting a piece in place. It would require facing whatever was being contained. The chain jerked, faster, and Gabriel felt the air shove hard enough to raise gooseflesh across his face. The woman reached toward the chain, not touching it, but interfering. Gabriel saw that the motion cost her effort. The outline of her body seemed to waver, as if proximity to that mechanism drained something from her. That hurt more than fear. He understood with cruel clarity that she existed there because she was part of the containment, part of the price, part of the mechanism. As long as the mansion kept the cycle incomplete, she would remain in that in-between state, holding, balancing, paying. The chain reached the edge of the central structure. One link struck stone with a dry, final sound. The contact made the entire chamber vibrate, and a long crack split the floor, cutting through the incomplete circle of old stains. The system was intensifying. Gabriel drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of choice press against every thought. He couldn't simply escape. He couldn't simply obey. He needed to understand the whole, fast. He stepped forward, toward the altar, not to place the brooch, but to study the split in the floor, the spreading fracture. Something about it felt wrong. Containment wasn't functioning the way it once had. The system felt worn, old, overloaded. Maybe the mansion wasn't only reacting to failure, maybe it was failing. The air rising from the crack didn't smell like mildew or damp stone or wood. It smelled like inside, a warm, mineral, organic smell, like it came from a body buried alive beneath the house. Gabriel felt his skin go cold and hot at once, his body's instinctive response to something that shouldn't exist. The temperature contrast was absurd. The corridor and walls remained icy, but the crack exhaled heat like fever breath. The chain reacted. The links trembled and tightened as if anchored to something invisible on the other side. The chain no longer advanced toward Gabriel. It curved, positioned itself between the altar and the crack. The movement looked defensive, a rusted guard dog trained not to let the ground open. The woman backed away slightly, and Gabriel saw she looked weaker than before. Her outline flickered, as if that breathing was draining her consistency. The fear he felt now was different, not fear of dying, not fear of losing his mind. It was fear of losing her presence entirely. Or worse, of keeping her trapped forever. The brooch in Gabriel's hand was too hot. The metal branded his skin like an ember. The central stone seemed to have its own light, pulsing slowly, as if answering the warm breath rising from the crack. Gabriel wondered, without daring to complete the thought, whether the brooch was the key to the prison, or the key to the thing imprisoned. The crack widened a little with a dry snap. Small bits of stone broke free and fell into the dark. The sound of falling didn't land on solid ground. It landed in depth. A long echo returned, as if the interior were a shaft cutting down through layers of the mansion. The breathing returned, not like wind, but like a slow, intentional flow. Gabriel felt hot air touch his face and noticed a detail that made him tremble. It came in intervals, like an inhale and an exhale. The crack was breathing. Above them, the mansion answered with a long groan. Not the sound of wood, the sound of something enormous trying to hold itself in. Gabriel felt the vibration travel through his bones. The whole house was being used as a lid. The chain tightened. A link scraped stone and sparked. The milky light wavered. For a moment, Gabriel saw something in the crack's darkness. Not a clear shape, but movement, a wet glint, as if something had shifted down there. He flinched back. His movement made the brooch vibrate, and with that vibration, a new burst of dark dust poured from his hand, like ash blown out from inside his body. The particles spun in the air, and when they met the crack's warm breath, they changed behavior. Instead of dispersing, they were pulled downward, sucked in like food. Gabriel's stomach rolled. Whatever was down there recognized his dust, recognized the ritual residue, recognized the past he was leaking. The woman moved closer to Gabriel again, closer than she ever had, and he felt in her a kind of controlled desperation. No scream, no word, but the certainty that the time for hesitation was ending. Gabriel understood that Act 1 of this story wasn't just the introduction of a mystery. It was the awakening of a consequence. He looked at the altar, at the brooch's slot, at the incomplete circle on the floor, and at the breathing crack. Everything belonged to the same mechanism. The brooch was the piece that completed the circle. The circle reinforced containment. Containment kept something trapped, and that trap kept the woman in an in-between state. Romance and horror were locked into the same gear. A cruel clarity settled in him. The love that once tried to save may have created the thing that now had to be contained. The mansion was the instrument of that containment. The woman was the price, and he was the key. The breathing in the floor intensified. Hot air rose harder, and with it came a low sound, almost inaudible, a murmur without words, only intention. Gabriel's body reacted as if it had heard its own name spoken by something without a mouth. The chain yanked violently. A sharp snap echoed as one link hooked onto the altar's edge, anchoring itself there. The crack opened a little more, and Gabriel saw, silent with horror, a wet, dark surface rising slowly, as if something were trying to reach the rim. The brooch flared in Gabriel's hand with sudden heat. Pain nearly made him drop it, but he held on. The central stone brightened, and for an instant Gabriel saw an image inside it, her face more alive, eyes full of ancient tears, and behind her, a shadow too large to fit in any room. The image vanished, leaving a certainty that crushed him. What's trapped isn't just a secret, it's something that feeds on memory, and he had just started feeding it. Around them, the mansion cracked as if it were about to change shape. The air vibrated. The corridor behind them seemed to lengthen, and Gabriel felt that if he didn't decide now, the place would decide for him. He looked at the woman, and the sadness in her eyes felt like a plea spanning decades, not to keep but to release. But release meant opening the prison, and opening the prison meant facing the thing breathing beneath them. Act 1 ended there with the most unsettling discovery. The mansion didn't hold only love and a promise. It held a living mistake, and the mistake was waking. The hot air spilling from the crack didn't stop. It pulsed in slow intervals as if something down there were regulating its own strength, testing limits, learning the space it had been denied for so long. Gabriel felt the skin of his face grow damp, not with sweat, but with that strange condensation that happens when incompatible temperatures collide. The mansion seemed to suffer a thermal imbalance that reflected something deeper. The emotional balance had been broken. The chain shuddered again, grinding with effort, as if it were being pulled from inside the stone. There was no longer any doubt. It wasn't an automatic mechanism. It was active containment, constantly under tension. Gabriel realized the mansion didn't function on its own. It worked because something, or someone, kept sustaining the system. The woman. The realization landed with physical weight. Gabriel watched the way she stayed near the crack without ever touching it directly, as if her mere presence were part of the seal. Her outline looked less defined at that point in the chamber, almost translucent at the edges, like an image beginning to unravel when the light shifts. The romance, silent and dense until then, revealed its cruelest face. Loving that woman meant keeping her there. It meant accepting that she would continue serving as balance, as counterweight, as price. Gabriel felt his heart contract with deep pain, pain that didn't come from fear of what was trapped, but from the injustice of who was paying for it. The crack widened another inch with a snap that sounded like bone breaking. The sound echoed through the chamber and climbed into the structure of the house. In response, something on the upper floor fell with a distant crash. The mansion was beginning to suffer physical consequences. The mistake wasn't contained only below anymore. It was contaminating everything. Gabriel stepped back and felt the chain react, shifting to match the crack's new position. One link slid, anchoring deeper into stone. The metal was stretched so tight it looked ready to snap. If it did, Gabriel wasn't sure what would come first, the house collapsing, or the full release of whatever was breathing there. He clenched the brooch, feeling the central stone pulse in response to the crack's proximity. For the first time, Gabriel realized the brooch didn't react only to him, but to the thing trapped below. There was a direct relationship, as if the object were a bridge between the mistake and its containment. A key forged in haste, without fully understanding what it was locking. The woman moved closer to Gabriel. She didn't touch him, but the distance was small enough that he felt a wave of emotion pass through him, a mix of profound love and ancient regret. It wasn't a present emotion. It was shared emotional memory, the kind of memory that doesn't need images to exist. Gabriel understood, his chest tightening, that this love hadn't been merely romantic. It had been absolute, so total it ignored natural limits, so total it tried to bargain with endings. And that attempt had created something that belonged neither to life nor to death. The mansion cracked again, irregular now. The sound came from multiple places at once, as if the entire structure were trying to adjust to a new configuration. Time inside felt less stable. Gabriel felt a brief displacement, as if he'd taken a step and arrived at a slightly different point in space. The chamber seemed to duplicate in invisible layers. He realized something even worse. The crack wasn't only growing outward, it was deepening inward. The thing trapped below didn't only want to rise, it wanted to spread through the house, like an ancient liquid finding seams. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, and Gabriel felt a wave of exhaustion move through her body as if it were his. She was weakening. The system demanded more and more from her to maintain balance. The love that held her there was slowly turning into continuous sacrifice. A silent rage rose in Gabriel. Not rage at the mansion, not at the trapped thing, but at himself. At the version of him who once believed he could fix everything alone, who could save without cost, who could love without accepting loss. That arrogance had built an unjust system, and now the system was failing. The brooch burned again, and a new vision slammed into Gabriel with more force than any before. The original ritual, more complete, candles lit around the chamber, the circle on the floor whole, the crack still sealed, the woman alive, kneeling, crying in silence, and him, decisive, trembling, convinced he was doing the right thing. The vision carried a brutal certainty. What was trapped hadn't been created. It had been diverted. Something natural had been interrupted, and the interruption had produced an incomplete entity, starving for continuation. The real conflict sharpened into cruel clarity. Keeping the prison meant keeping the mistake alive, controlled but still active. Releasing it meant facing something that could destroy the mansion, and perhaps him. But releasing it also meant freeing the woman, allowing her to finally stop existing in that suspended state. Love now demanded an impossible choice. The crack breathed harder. The chain groaned, threatening to break, and Gabriel understood Act 2 wouldn't be about escape, but about deciding who would pay the final price. The urge to flee surged like an animal reflex, then was crushed by a brutal awareness fleeing didn't exist here. The mansion had already proven doors vanish, corridors lengthen, time doubles. Gabriel could run until his lungs burned and still end up at the same point, like a body trapped inside a repeating thought. He backed away a few steps inside the chamber, distancing himself from the crack, but felt the air follow his movement as if space clung to him. The chain remained taut, and the hot breath kept rising. The thing breathed with patience. Gabriel realized it didn't need haste. It needed repetition. It needed time, and time was exactly what the mansion had too much of. The woman stayed near the altar. Gabriel noticed that the closer she stood to the center, the more stable her outline became. It was as if the altar anchored her, as if the place that kept her imprisoned also kept her whole. That was perverse. She existed better in the place that trapped her. Gabriel held the brooch and felt the temptation again to set it in place, a simple, almost elegant gesture promising quiet and stability. But quiet would only be the continuation of captivity, and stability would only be delay. With aching clarity, Gabriel understood the mansion had been built to wait, and waiting was how it won. Nothing would end if he chose the easiest path. The crack snapped again. A fragment of stone fell, and the echo returned too late, as if from far below. The chain answered with a violent tug, and Gabriel saw a link tremble so hard it looked ready to split. The ancient metal wouldn't hold much longer. He looked at the woman and felt guilt so intense it nearly dropped him. That guilt wasn't only present tense. It belonged to the past reforming inside him. His body remembered what his mind still refused. He had put her there. He had left her as counterweight. He had chosen imprisonment as a way to save. The romance became a wound. There was no simple sweetness in loving someone you yourself condemned to wait. Love there was at once the most beautiful thing and the least forgivable. The mansion cracked above them, and Gabriel felt the space shift sharply. The chamber seemed to retreat, pulled inward, and the stone corridor reappeared ahead, longer than it had been. The door they'd entered through opened on its own, silently, as if the house were offering a strategic retreat. Gabriel understood. The mansion wanted to pull them away from the breaking point, or guide them somewhere else where the cycle could be reinforced. The woman moved out of the chamber with silent urgency. Gabriel followed. The stone corridor felt colder, and the walls displayed new signs, marks that hadn't existed before, as if the place were rewriting itself. The dripping now came from the walls themselves, not the ceiling, creating the impossible sense of infiltration. When they reached the upper landing, the mansion seemed to have shifted moods. The dim corridor outside was brighter for a moment, and the scent of white flowers intensified as if someone had just sprayed perfume into the air. Gabriel's heart tightened. That perfume always came before a revelation. They crossed the corridor and reached the hall again. The chandelier was off, but a pale light seemed to float in the space without any source. Gabriel looked at the portraits on the wall and realized, slow horror, that one of them had changed. It wasn't subtle. It was an obvious alteration, as if the paint had been retouched by invisible hands. The portrait showed a man from another era, dressed in dark clothes, his expression severe. Gabriel had noticed that painting when he came in, but now the man's face looked familiar. The gaze in the portrait, once distant, now carried the same tilt as Gabriel's, the same line at the corner of the mouth, the same shape of nose, as if layer by layer the painting were moving closer to his own face. Gabriel backed away, his throat tightening. The canvas was updating itself. The mansion was recording his return literally. The past was adjusting to include him, as if the story weren't merely being remembered but rewritten. He looked at the other portraits. A second painting farther down the wall also seemed different. A woman in old-fashioned clothes, her gaze sorrowful. Now her expression resembled the woman walking beside Gabriel too closely. It was as if the mansion were pulling older versions of them to the surface, inscribing them onto the walls to guarantee permanence. The feeling of being watched changed. It wasn't only the house watching anymore. It was history looking back through paint. Gabriel felt a deep cold when he understood the danger. If the mansion was rewriting portraits to reflect the present, then it was trying to fix the present into the past, turn it into part of the cycle. That was how it trapped you. Not only with doors and chains, but with narrative, with destiny. The dragging sound returned, louder now, from below. The hall floor vibrated faintly, as if something enormous were moving beneath the boards. Gabriel felt the brooch pulse with heat. The thing trapped down there was rising, or spreading. The woman stopped in front of a particular portrait, larger than the others, covered by a dark cloth. Gabriel didn't remember seeing that covering before. It was as if the painting had been hidden until the right moment. The fabric fluttered slightly, even without wind. The mansion seemed to hold its breath. A bitter intuition struck Gabriel. The covered portrait held the image he didn't want to see, the truest version of the past, proof of the original mistake. The dragging below made the house groan. A thin crack appeared in the hall ceiling and dust fell like gray snow. The mansion's time was running out. Containment was failing. Gabriel reached for the cloth, not knowing if the gesture was courage or condemnation. The fabric gave with minimal resistance, as if it had been placed there only to delay the inevitable. Gabriel pulled slowly, feeling it slide through his fingers, and dust rose in small clouds that took too long to settle. The mansion seemed to keep everything suspended when a revelation was about to happen, as if even gravity waited. The portrait was revealed. It was larger than the rest, and the frame, heavier, was carved with flowers and branches that echoed the brooch's signature. The paint was preserved in an absurd way, the colors still deep, as if time had spared that canvas out of fear. The image showed a couple standing in a formal pose, but there was something intimate in the way their bodies were close, not close by convention, but by necessity. The man in the portrait was Gabriel, not merely similar. Him, with cruel exactness, the shape of the face, the line of the jaw, the slight tension in the left shoulder as if bearing an invisible weight. The clothes were from another era, a dark suit, and the expression wasn't that of a happy man. It was the look of someone who made a decision and already knows the price, but doesn't turn back. Beside him stood the woman. Her face there didn't have the presence blurred quality. It was sharp, solid, entirely human. Her eyes held restrained tears, and her body leaned slightly toward him, as if love were also a kind of physical support. On the collar of her dress, the brooch gleamed, but the detail that broke Gabriel from the inside came when he noticed the background. Behind the couple, in the painting's penumbra, there was a stone door left ajar, and inside it, a deep darkness. It wasn't merely scenery. It was a threat, an abyss painted with intention, and in front of that door, almost invisible, was the outline of a chain. The portrait wasn't a celebration. It was a containment record. Gabriel felt his whole body go cold. The brooch in his hand turned colder too, as if it recognized its own image in paint. His heart beat irregularly, and a full memory began to form behind his eyes. Not a brief flash, but a block of experience forcing its way up all at once. He closed his eyes on instinct, as if he could delay it, but delay was no longer possible. The memory imposed itself with brutal clarity. Him in the subterranean chamber, candles lit, the circle on the floor complete. Her kneeling, not in submission but weakness, illness in her, an imminent ending, a body that wouldn't endure much longer. His love, desperate, refusing to accept it. And the ritual, improvised with conviction, using the mansion as an anchor because the mansion already knew how to keep things that shouldn't go away. The memory moved to its cruelest point. The moment he realized the ritual wasn't saving her, it was trapping her. It was creating an in-between state, neither life nor death, and along with that, it was tearing from the world a consequence that should have followed its natural course. That consequence took shape in the darkness of the fissure, something without a name, something made of interruption, denial, distorted love. An entity not evil in the human sense, but hungry in the natural sense, hungry for completeness, hungry for an ending, because the ending had been killed before it could happen. And then came the part Gabriel had tried hardest to forget, the final gesture, him setting the brooch into the altar, the central stone shining like an eye, the circle closing, the chain being pulled from the floor as if rising out of the house itself, and the inevitable choice, to keep the incomplete thing trapped. Someone had to remain linked to the system. Her, the woman accepting without words, not because she wanted to, but because she understood that if she didn't, the incomplete thing would get out and devour everything around it. The house, the place, perhaps lives. Her love, in that instant, became sacrifice, and his love, in that same instant, became eternal guilt. Gabriel opened his eyes with a short exhale, and the hall felt more fragile, as if reality had cracked under the weight of remembering. He looked at the portrait and noticed something even more disturbing. The paint on his face looked wet, as if it had been applied recently, as if the portrait were updating itself as he remembered. At the lower corner of the frame there was an inscription. Gabriel leaned in, throat tight. The letters were old, carved carefully, so that she may remain, the ending must be bound. Gabriel's legs weakened. He had killed the ending, not in the literal sense of killing someone, but in the sense of preventing natural closure. He had interrupted death, and in doing so he had created something that belonged nowhere. And to bind that thing, he had bound his own love. Below, the mansion groaned hard. The dragging came closer, vibrating through the floor. A larger crack opened in the corner of the ceiling and dust poured down in a cascade. Time was collapsing inside the house. The portrait, the proof, wasn't only memory. It was a trigger. Gabriel turned and saw the mirror in the corridor reflect something the real world did not show. Behind him, on the staircase, a huge shadow was climbing slowly. It wasn't a person. It was a heavy outline, like a mass of darkness with its own density. And in the reflection, The shadow seemed to look directly at him. The trapped thing was finding a path. The woman beside Gabriel seemed to struggle to remain whole. Her outline wavered. The house demanded from her more than she could give. Gabriel understood the conflict had leveled up. It was no longer about discovering. It was about preventing repetition. And preventing repetition would require the opposite act from the original, accepting the ending, freeing the flow, undoing the cycle. But undoing the cycle meant opening the prison, and opening the prison meant facing the incomplete entity, and perhaps being consumed by it. The flower mark no longer burned. What hurt now was the slow, corrosive understanding that the shape imprinted on his skin wasn't only a consequence of prolonged contact with the brooch. It was a seal, a sign of belonging. Gabriel felt the raised texture under his fingers, as if the design had been pressed from the inside out, as if his body had accepted it before his mind did. The mirror still showed the shadow frozen on the last step. It didn't advance. It didn't retreat. It simply waited. That patience was more terrifying than any attack. Gabriel sensed the entity understood something essential. As long as he hesitated, the cycle would remain suspended. As long as his love stayed split between protecting and releasing, nothing had to be done. Around them, the mansion began to show clearer signs of strain. A dry crack echoed from the ceiling, and a beam released enough dust to form a thick cloud in the air. The smell of ancient wood mixed with the warm smell rising from below, creating a nearly suffocating blend. The house was being forced to hold more than it could bear. The woman stepped back and leaned lightly against the corridor wall. Gabriel saw the movement cost her real effort. Her outline flickered again, like a flame in air without enough oxygen. That suspended existence depended directly on the mansion's integrity and the cycle's continuity. If the house fell, she would fall with it, but not in the sense of liberation, in the sense of incomplete disappearance. The romance revealed its cruelest face. Gabriel realized the love binding them had been used as a containment structure, not out of conscious malice, but desperation. He had turned the most intimate feeling into the foundation of a monstrous system, and now undoing the system meant dismantling love as it had been lived. In the mirror, the shadow tilted slightly, as if it sensed Gabriel's internal shift. The movement wasn't abrupt. It was almost elegant. The entity seemed to be learning human emotion through prolonged observation. Every hesitation, every pain, every guilt was silent nourishment. The dragging returned, now clearly coming from the staircase. Gabriel felt the floor vibrate under his feet. The echo of movement was more defined, less diffuse. The thing was nearing the surface of the house. The fissure, now out of sight, was no longer the only access point. The mansion was giving way from within. Gabriel looked at the portrait again. The paint seemed even more alive, as if remembering had strengthened the pigment. The gaze of the man in the painting himself seemed to hold a mute plea. Not for absolution, but correction. The past didn't ask forgiveness, it asked closure. The woman lifted her hand and touched her chest again. Gabriel felt the mirrored pressure. The gesture carried something different now, not urgency but preparation, like someone accepting the ending is near but wanting it to be complete, dignified, final. Gabriel understood then what the entity truly represented. It wasn't a monster in the classic sense. It was the remainder, the residue of what happens when you prevent an ending from happening. A thing made of forced continuation, of memory that cannot rest, of love refusing to accept loss. The entity existed because closure had been denied, and now it wanted what had been stolen from it, a conclusion. The brooch, still stuck to Gabriel's hand as if it had bonded to his skin, began to cool again. The central stone lost its sharp shine and turned dull, as if preparing for a different use, not as a key for containment, but as a key for release. The mansion groaned loud, deep and continuous, traveling through walls and floor. Gabriel felt a sudden displacement of air, as if distant doors had all been opened at once. The corridor behind him seemed to stretch even farther, and the hall gained an unreal depth, as if space were being pulled to accommodate something too large. In the mirror, the shadow took a step forward. The reflection showed the outline becoming more defined, closer to human shape, still distorted but trying. There was an attempt at imitation. The entity was learning how to move, how to wait, how to want. The horror wasn't in its appearance, but in its gradual intelligence. Gabriel felt his body settle into a strange, forced calm. Panic gave way to cold clarity. He understood Act 2 wouldn't be solved by direct confrontation. There was no physical fight possible against that. The only weapon available was full acceptance of what had been avoided, the ending. But accepting the ending would require more than opening the prison. It would require owning the guilt without trying to pay it off with a new sacrifice. It would require loving without binding, It would require allowing the woman to stop existing in that space, even if it meant never feeling her the same way again. In the reflection, the entity stepped closer. The floor trembled. A section of ceiling collapsed at the far end of the hall with a dry crash. The house was at its limit. Gabriel closed his eyes for a second and made a silent decision, still incomplete but firm enough to shift something in the system. The brooch answered with a faint warmth. The mark on his skin pulsed. The cycle would not be reinforced, but he still had to find how to break it without creating something worse. The mirror shouldn't have been able to show the subterranean chamber. Basic physics had already fractured inside that house, but even so, there was a difference between walls moving and a reflection becoming a passage. The mirror's glass looked darker, deeper, as if it weren't a surface, but an opening. Gabriel approached slowly, feeling the air grow colder as he neared it. The reflected image wasn't static. The chamber's milky light pulsed slowly, and the fissure's warm breath seemed to ripple as if it were visible. Gabriel's throat tightened when he realized the reflection wasn't only a vision. It was a summons, an invitation to return to the point where everything began, and finish it the right way. The woman stayed beside him, closer than before, and Gabriel noticed her presence seemed to suffer less near the mirror. Her outline became slightly more defined in front of that opening, as if the mirror was a more natural route for her than any ordinary door. As if the place where she truly existed was there, on the boundary between states. The dragging on the stairs stopped for a moment, replaced by tense silence. Gabriel sensed the entity in the hall, that shadow, was waiting, as if it knew the mirror offered a different path. Maybe it couldn't cross there. Maybe the mirror was the only place Gabriel could act without being interrupted. He extended his hand toward the glass. The surface wasn't cold like an ordinary mirror. It was cold like damp stone, and when he touched it, his finger sank a few millimeters, as if the glass were thick liquid. A shock ran up his arm, and the flower mark on his skin burned faintly. The brooch answered with a dull glow. The mansion accepted his approach. Gabriel drew a deep breath and pressed harder. The mirror yielded, opening like a membrane. Warm air escaped, bringing back the smell of wax, iron, and wet earth. Gabriel felt a brief surge of nausea and stepped through. The passage wasn't like stepping through a door. It was like moving through an old thought. The sensation was an inward displacement, as if part of his body stayed behind for a second and then got yanked through. When Gabriel emerged on the other side, he was back in the subterranean chamber, except the chamber wasn't exactly the same. It felt more alive. The crack in the floor was wider, and the breathing coming from within was stronger, more confident. The chain groaned under extreme tension, the links vibrating as if they were about to snap. The milky light was more unstable, wavering like a flame on the verge of dying or exploding. The woman came through right after him, and Gabriel felt an emotional impact. Here, she seemed both more solid and more fragile. Solid because the place of origin recognized her, fragile because the place of origin was collapsing. The dragging sound wasn't distant anymore. Now it was a constant background noise coming from somewhere above, but also from inside the walls, as if the entity in the hall was trying to find the same access. The mansion had become contested ground. Gabriel moved closer to the stone altar. The circular recess looked deeper, and there were fresh marks around it, recent scratches, as if the brooch had been set in and pulled out again and again in desperate attempts. The circle of stains on the floor looked almost complete, missing only a small segment, exactly where the crack cut through the pattern. The system would not allow a perfect conclusion while the crack existed, and the crack existed because the ending had been denied. Gabriel held the brooch carefully. The mark on his hand seemed to guide his fingers. He didn't want to repeat the original gesture, but he understood the brooch still had a function. Maybe this time the brooch wasn't meant to bind. It was meant to open the correct path for the ending. A key can lock and unlock. The mistake isn't the key, it's the intention. That was when Gabriel noticed something on the altar that hadn't been there before. An envelope. Not just any envelope. The same yellowed paper as the letter he'd found in the intimate room, with the same floral seal. But this one looked newer. The edges were less worn. The ink on the name looked wet. Gabriel leaned in and read, shivering, Gabriel Aureliosaurus, again. But there was an extra detail, a line below in faster handwriting. For when you're ready to lose without binding. Gabriel's throat tightened. The letter was there, waiting to be read, yet the paper looked freshly placed, as if it had been written in a time that hadn't happened yet, as if the mansion were folding the future to deliver it to the present. He opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet. The first lines were written, but the text ended abruptly mid-sentence, as if the rest couldn't exist yet. Beneath the last words, there was blank space, too much blank space to be accidental. Gabriel understood with deep cold. The letter wasn't complete because it depended on a choice that hadn't been made. The future text would exist only if he made the final decision. The mansion wasn't only keeping the past, it was trying to write the right closure. The hot breath from the crack intensified, as if the entity below sensed the nearness of the gesture. The chain shuddered violently. One link split with a dry snap. The system was seconds from failing. Gabriel looked at the brooch, the altar recess, and the unfinished letter. He understood that to break the cycle, he would have to do what he had never done, accept total loss without trying to compensate through containment. The blank letter was a cruel symbol. The ending wasn't written yet because he had always avoided writing it. The snap of the link breaking wasn't loud. It was dry, final, like bone breaking without a scream. The chain lost part of its tension and gave several inches, dragging across the stone floor with a heavy scrape. The crack responded immediately, widening like a mouth that smells food and prepares to bite. Hot air surged hard enough to make Gabriel squeeze his eyes shut. When he opened them, he had the impression the space above the crack was warped, as if the air there were thicker, slower. Something invisible shifted at the boundary, pressing, molding itself to what room it had. The entity no longer needed only to breathe. It was trying to rise. A brutal impulse surged through Gabriel. Not conscious thought, an internal primitive command. Set the brooch in. The gesture promised immediate relief. It promised to seal the crack, retighten the chain, return the mansion to the heavy silence of waiting. It promised to protect the woman, keep her whole in that in-between state, spare her from complete dissolution. His love reacted first. The idea of watching her vanish completely, not present, not near, not even possible, hurt almost beyond endurance. Gabriel felt his chest seized, tears threatened. Love wanted to preserve, to keep, to guarantee presence, even distorted. The entity noticed. The hot breath shifted rhythm, slower, more calculated. Gabriel felt something touch the rim of the crack, not a hand, not a tentacle, but pressure, like shapeless flesh learning where to brace. A low sound, almost like a satisfied sigh, drifted up from the opening. The trap thing was learning to desire like a human. The woman took a step back, and a wave of emotion struck Gabriel, deep fear, not of the entity, but of himself. Fear that, at the decisive moment, love would make him repeat the mistake. Fear he would choose the comfort of presence over the honesty of loss. The brooch burned in Gabriel's hand. The flower mark pulsed hard, and another wave of dark dust seeped from his skin, immediately sucked down into the crack. Gabriel felt himself weaken for a second, as if every released fragment of memory was stolen energy. The entity fed on it. It didn't need to escape fully to win. It needed only for him to keep remembering the wrong way, remembering in order to keep, not to conclude. Each hesitation was food. Each attempt to preserve was reinforcement. Gabriel looked at the altar. The circular recess seemed to gleam with anticipation. The system was ready to receive the brooch again, ready to repeat, ready to close the circle and condemn them all to the same flawed eternity. A mental portrait of the past forced itself on him setting the brooch in place, the chain strengthening, the crack sealing, the mansion sighing in relief. And then the long silence, time held still, the woman trapped, the entity contained but alive, always alive. The entity rose higher. Now Gabriel could see something forming at the edge of the crack, a dark, irregular surface with a wet, pulsing texture. There was no face, but there was intention. No eyes, but perception. It didn't need to see to know where Gabriel was. It felt him as an extension of the mistake that had created it. The dragging sound above stopped. The silence afterward was terrifying. Gabriel realized the shadow in the hall, the entity's more dispersed version, wasn't moving anymore because it didn't need to. Everything that mattered was happening here, in the chamber. The woman moved toward Gabriel slowly. This time, her closeness carried finality. Not a request, not a warning. Acceptance. She seemed to understand she couldn't go on existing that way, that her permanence was part of the problem, and that understanding hurt more than any external threat. Gabriel felt love change shape. It didn't vanish or cool, it matured brutally. He understood that love isn't preventing an ending, but crossing through it without lying. That the original mistake wasn't trying to save, but trying to control the outcome. The unfinished letter on the altar fluttered slightly, as if reacting to his internal shift. The blank space seemed to expand, demanding writing, demanding decision. The entity reacted. The hot breath turned aggressive, almost a shove. The crack opened a little more, and the pulsing surface advanced, bracing itself on the rim. A low, deep sound slipped out, somewhere between a groan and a satisfied breath. Gabriel felt nausea and anger at once. That thing wanted to exist. It wanted to use his mistake as a body. The brooch felt like it weighed a ton now. Gabriel sensed that if he let go, it would drop straight into the altar's recess, as if the system were pulling it. The mansion wanted repetition. The house was built to keep, not to release. Releasing meant failing its function, but the function of the house didn't have to be his fate. Gabriel inhaled deeply, feeling the crack's hot air mix with the stone's cold. For the first time since entering the mansion, he didn't try to control his emotions. He let the pain of loss exist whole, without bargaining. He allowed himself to imagine the world without that presence at his side, without that suspended possibility. The entity felt it and reacted violently. The crack snapped, and a large fragment of stone broke free and fell in with a deep echo. The chain groaned, almost snapping entirely. Time was running out. Gabriel understood the conflict wouldn't be resolved by sealing or fleeing, but by a conscious refusal to repeat. He had to refuse the gesture the entity wanted from him, and that refusal would have a price. The crack didn't open all at once. It tore through the floor with the cruel slowness of something that knows it can't be stopped anymore. Stone gave way in successive snaps, each one echoing through the mansion like a late warning. Gabriel felt the floor vibrate under his feet, and the sound traveled up the walls, through corridors, across staircases, making the chandelier in the hall groan like an ancient alarm bell. Hot air surged, forcing the chamber's cold into the corners. The milky light shattered into unstable bands, and for a moment Gabriel felt as if reality itself were cracking along with the stone. The smell grew stronger, nearly unbearable, something too organic for a cellar, too alive to be ancient. The entity began to emerge, not as a complete body, but as a collection of attempts. A dark pulsing surface pushed up from the fissure, shaping itself to whatever space it could claim. There was no fixed form. It was as if the thing were learning what it meant to have limits. The texture was meat-like but disorganized, without recognizable anatomy, a mistake trying to become matter. Gabriel's stomach lurched. The fear that came wasn't only fear of being attacked, but fear of understanding too much. He understood the entity was made of interruption, of endings ripped away before they could happen, of stories that couldn't finish. It wasn't malicious by intent, but by origin. It existed because someone, him, had refused to let something die. The woman screamed without sound. No voice, but impact, an emotional blast. Gabriel felt her despair cut through him like a blade. Her presence wavered violently, as if proximity to the entity drained her existence. The edges of her outline began to dissolve, turning too translucent. The link between her and the system was breaking, not in liberation but collapse. The chain gave another link with a dry snap. The ancient metal could not hold. Each break let the entity advance another few inches. The containment system was failing in a chain reaction, and Gabriel realized that if the entity fully escaped, the mansion would be only the first body it used. The brooch slipped again in Gabriel's hand, pulled by an invisible force. The altar's recess seemed to suck the metal toward it. The temptation returned with desperate strength. Set it in, seal it, save what could still be saved. Love, again, offered a false mercy. But Gabriel didn't close his hand. He let the brooch fall. Metal struck stone with a clear sound and rang through the chamber like a bell of decision. The central stone rolled a few inches and stopped at the edge of the recess, but it didn't lock in. The system failed to complete the gesture. The entity reacted violently. The hot breath became a jet. The crack spread wider, and the thing rose to what might have been the height of a torso. A sudden movement shattered stone around it into shards. The sound was deafening. Gabriel felt himself shoved backward, slamming into the stone wall. The pain was real, physical, but barely registered. The mansion groaned like a wounded animal. The chamber ceiling cracked, and fragments began to fall. The space could no longer bear the pressure. Panic surged in Gabriel, but something stronger held him in place, the certainty this was the only chance. The cycle couldn't be reinforced. It had to be broken completely, even if it destroyed the house. The woman moved toward Gabriel with difficulty. Her body seemed heavier, as if pulled toward two states at once. Gabriel felt love become absolute urgency. He couldn't save her by keeping her there. He had to free her by accepting the ending he'd always avoided. He placed himself between the entity and the woman, not as a physical shield, but as a choice. The gesture was instinctive. The entity answered with a low, almost irritated sound and surged forward another fraction. The closeness brought something worse than fear. Gabriel felt fragments of memories that weren't his trying to seep in, as if the thing wanted to use his mind as a mold. He shut his eyes and did what he had never done before. He let loss exist whole, without resistance. He pictured the moment he should have let go. He felt the pain without turning away. He didn't try to fix it, didn't negotiate, he simply accepted. The entity shuddered. Its advance hesitated. The pulsing surface lost rhythm for a second, as if it had run into something it couldn't consume. With brutal clarity, Gabriel realized the thing fed on the refusal of endings. By accepting loss, he was starving it. The crack began to respond differently. It no longer widened. It vibrated, unstable. The chain, now almost useless, groaned one last time and dropped inert to the floor. The mansion began to collapse. The sound of wood snapping echoed above. The hall, the stairs, the corridors, everything seemed to answer the collapse of the core. The house had no function without containment. The vault was being emptied by force. Gabriel opened his eyes and saw something unexpected. The entity was shrinking. Not because it was being pushed, but because it was losing cohesion. The irregular mass began to unravel into dark vapor, pulled back into the fissure like smoke drawn into an inverted drain. Beside him, the woman began to stabilize. Her outline grew more defined, calmer. For the first time, Gabriel felt something in her close to peace, not happiness, but imminent rest. On the floor, the brooch cracked with a dry snap. The central stone split in two, and the inner glow went completely out. The key was broken. The cycle could no longer be closed the same way. The entity gave one last sound, not rage but hollow frustration, and was yanked back down as the fissure began to close slowly like a wound caught. Rising, the chamber shook. The ceiling threatened to fall. Gabriel knew they had little time. Act 2 neared its end with a terrifying certainty. The worst part wasn't facing the entity. It was surviving the mansion's collapse, and the final goodbye that was coming. Her smile wasn't joy. It was relief. That kind of softness that appears on someone's face after carrying too much weight for too long and finally feeling they can put it down, even if putting it down means disappearing. Gabriel felt his chest sink with sharp sadness, because he understood without being told. That smile wasn't the beginning of a romance. It was the end of a prison. The chamber shuddered in short, repeating waves. Stones fell from the ceiling in small, dry showers. The milky light flickered, growing weaker and weaker, like a bulb about to go out. The air, once hot from the crack's presence, began to cool fast. It was as if the place were losing its fever and slipping into a slow death. Gabriel stepped toward her on instinct, as if closeness could stop what was about to happen. But there was no gesture that could stop it. Her freedom was tied to the collapse of the system. The system was collapsing, so she would be free in the most final way. He felt a desperate urge to ask her to stay, even without words, even without dialogue. The emotion formed whole and heavy inside him. But in the same instant, the memory of the original mistake hit him like a blow. Asking her to stay was exactly what the imprisonment meant. It was repeating, even gently. It was trying to hold a presence that should no longer be held. Love there demanded the opposite of impulse. It demanded allowing. Somewhere above, the mansion groaned with a sound so deep Gabriel felt it in his bones. It sounded like a massive structure losing its fit. The stone corridor trembled, and a straight-line crack split a section of wall, opening a dark seam. A cold wind swept through the chamber as if it came from outside, carrying the smell of rain and soil. The house was opening to the outer world. It was letting ordinary time back in. Gabriel noticed the broken brooch on the floor. The central stone was split. No shine, no promise. That break was more than material destruction. It was proof there would be no return to the old solution. There would be no more elegant containment, no more safe cycle. He had broken the mechanism, and by breaking it, he had also broken the last excuse to keep everything suspended. For an instant, the woman became sharper, as if liberation gave her a final clarity. Her eyes, so sad, so old, now looked light, as if they were no longer carrying the weight of waiting. Gabriel felt a wave of emotional memory, intense and clean, a night of candles, hands touching, tears falling without sound, and the invisible vow that bound them. There had been no words, but there had been a promise. And now that promise had to be kept the right way. The ceiling cracked loudly. A larger stone fell a few yards from them and shattered into pieces. Gabriel realized he had seconds, maybe a minute, before the chamber collapsed completely. He looked toward the corridor, but the urgency wasn't only physical, it was emotional. He knew that if he ran, he would carry the feeling of abandonment with him, as if he'd left her behind again. That was unbearable, but he also knew staying there wasn't saving her. It was dying alongside a story that finally had to end. He moved closer carefully, without touching. The air around them trembled, faintly. Gabriel smelled white flowers again, strong, like the perfume that always announced her presence, now announcing goodbye. The romance there was almost unbearable in its cruel purity. loving someone, and out of love, allowing them to stop existing, the mansion cracked once more, and the milky light began to die. The chamber sank into shadow, and Gabriel felt a childish fear rise, fear of darkness as closure, darkness as a period at the end. Then something unexpected happened. The envelope with the unfinished letter, resting on the altar, slid on its own toward the edge, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The page inside loosened and drifted to the floor near Gabriel's feet. Gabriel looked. The words that had ended mid-sentence before were now complete. The ink looked fresh. The final text didn't describe details. It described acceptance. It spoke of releasing without holding, of loving without binding, of recognizing that the ending isn't defeat but rest. And in the last section there was a line that struck Gabriel with the force of truth. If I smile, don't try to hold on. My smile is proof you succeeded. Tears finally escaped, silent, hot. Gabriel's body shook, but not from fear, from grief, real grief, grief he'd avoided for decades, for lifetimes, through layers of himself, grief that could finally happen whole. She smiled again, softer. The edges of her outline began to dissolve, like light thinning out. It wasn't an abrupt vanishing. It was a slow release, like mist opening to the sun. Gabriel felt the pressure in his chest ease, as if an ancient knot were loosening. Love wasn't ending. It was changing shape, becoming memory, not prison. The chamber jolted violently. Part of the ceiling collapsed in the corridor. The exit began to choke with rubble. Gabriel understood the turning point of Act 2 wasn't the entity's defeat. It was the inevitable loss that came with liberation. He would have to leave, and leaving meant accepting that she would not come. Gabriel ran, but not like someone fleeing a visible enemy. He ran like someone sprinting through grief on fire. Every step in the stone corridor felt heavy, as if the floor were trying to hold him back, out of longing, out of guilt, out of habit. The sound of stones falling behind him didn't feel like simple ruin. It felt like the mansion closing its mouth, as if it wanted to swallow its secret along with whoever had learned it. The air grew colder as he pushed forward. The milky light vanished completely, and the corridor fell into darkness, punctured only by occasional sparks, metal scraping stone, or wood snapping somewhere far away. Gabriel reached out and found the damp wall, using touch to guide himself. The flower mark on his skin still pulsed, not with the brooch's heat, but with phantom pain, a seal that doesn't vanish when the object breaks, a reminder that the body also keeps things. Behind him, the space where she had been seemed to go out. There was no farewell sound, no external sign, only the sudden, absolute sense of absence, clean, complete, like a door closing inside his chest. The impact landed as an emptiness that wasn't a hole, but newly freed space. The mansion had stopped holding, and with that, he stopped feeling her beside him. Love remained, but now as living memory. A memory that didn't demand return. The corridor jolted with a stronger quake. Gabriel heard a loud crack and felt the floor tilt slightly. The mansion was failing in a cascade. Once the containment mechanism broke, it no longer made structural sense. It was as if the house had been built with the secret as its central pillar, and once the pillar was removed, the rest began to collapse for lack of purpose. A stone fell ahead, partially blocking the passage. Gabriel stopped, chest heaving, searching for a way around. To the right, the wall had split, forming an irregular opening. Cold wind poured through it, carrying the scent of rain and earth. That was either the outside or another part of the mansion now open to ordinary reality. He didn't have time to choose carefully. He shoved himself through, tearing his sleeve on the rough stone, feeling his skin burn. The opening led to a narrow staircase made of old wood and stone mixed together, as if it had been improvised over the years. The air there was less heavy. Gabriel climbed fast, hearing collapse behind him. Each step trembled underfoot, and dust fell from above like ash. At the top he found a door, a normal door, old wood, with a real knob. The contrast was brutal. After doors that vanished and walls that rewrote themselves, that door felt almost offensive in its normality. Gabriel turned the knob and pushed. The hall opened before him, but it wasn't the hall he'd known when he entered. The mansion was in the process of dying. The chandelier hung crooked, as if the ceiling had partially given. Dust filled the air, and the light coming through the windows was gray, filtered by heavy clouds. Part of the staircase had cracked, a step lay split in two. The portraits on the walls trembled. Some had fallen, frames shattered, painted faces turned toward the floor like the dead. The large portrait of the couple, once revealed, now hung askew, and the paint seemed to fade before Gabriel's eyes, not like an old painting, but like an image losing meaning once the cycle ended. Gabriel approached the canvas, heart tight, and saw her face was no longer clear. The lines were dissolving, as if the mansion could no longer keep or record it. The past was being released or erased the natural way it always should have been. The shadow in the corridor mirror was gone. The glass reflected only dust and pale light. The entity had vanished. There was no dragging, no subterranean vibration. The silence now was ordinary, almost banal, and that banality hurt. It was proof everything had ended for real. Gabriel crossed the hall unsteadily, legs weak, not only from physical strain but emotional exhaustion. His body seemed to be trying to reorganize without the weight of the cycle, like learning to exist in a straight line again, without folds. The front door stood ajar, and the outside wind pushed dust inward. Gabriel approached and, as he crossed the threshold, felt the difference immediately. The outside had sounds. A distant bird call, a faint rustle of leaves, branches whispering. The ordinary world continued, indifferent to what had happened. He went down the entry steps and stopped on the driveway, looking back. The mansion looked smaller, not physically, spiritually, like a body that had lost something vital. The tall windows reflected the sky without intention. The facade looked tired, and for a moment Gabriel realized something that hurt in a strange way. The house no longer recognized him. The sensation of being watched was gone. The mansion was no longer alive. A tear slid down Gabriel's face, not only for her but for the mansion itself. A place can be guilty and still be sad when it dies. The mansion had been instrument of love and prison at the same time. Now, without function, it was simply returning to the common fate of things, ruin. A loud crack came from inside. An upstairs window shattered, glass falling in near silence. Then another cracked. It was as if the house were exhaling its last breath in pieces. Gabriel took a few steps away, letting the cold outdoor air fill his lungs. But the hollow in his chest remained. He knew the climax wasn't truly over, because even though the entity had been contained and undone, there was one last thing to face. What remains after correcting an error this large? A world without her. A world with a full memory. A world where love can't be used as an excuse to avoid loss. The mark on Gabriel's hand pulsed like a small heart, and the pain was so sharp he reflexively curled his fingers as if he could contain whatever was trying to speak through his skin. A sound from inside the mansion, a door opening somewhere within, echoed into the damp air of the driveway with a strange timbre, deeper than any wooden creak. It sounded like a door opening not into a room but into a lair. Gabriel stood still for a few seconds in front of the iron gate, hesitating with his body already half turned toward the outside world. It felt like standing with one foot in freedom and one foot in a call that doesn't end when it ends. The mansion didn't recognize him anymore. He was sure of it, and yet something in it insisted on one last gesture, as if the place, before dying, wanted to give what it had never dared to give while it was alive. He didn't go back out of curiosity. He went back because he had learned the mansion never offered anything without reason. He went back because the mark on his skin kept pulsing, as if the decision was inevitable. When he climbed the steps, again, the air in the hall was even thicker with dust. Gray light slanted through cracked windows, laying pale rectangles across the floor. The silence was different now, not the vigilant silence from before, but the brittle silence of ruin, a silence that cracks. The sound of the internal door came from the side corridor. Gabriel walked carefully, stepping around broken frame pieces and scattered glass. The floorboards creaked in different tones, some normal, others deeper, as if certain planks were about to give way. The mansion felt like a body with broken bones trying to hold its shape. In the corridor, a door stood open. Gabriel didn't remember seeing it before. It was set into a section of wall that had previously been only old wallpaper and a small painting. Now the painting had fallen, and behind it the door appeared as if it had always been there, hidden by the house's choice. Gabriel went in. The room was narrow but long, like an archive. The air smelled different, aged paper, old leather, and that faint note of white flowers that seemed to have become part of the place itself. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes, bound books, and envelopes. A private archive, forgotten for decades, preserved like a relic. At the center stood a wooden table with an old lamp, unpowered, of course, and on the table an object that stopped Gabriel like a blow, an open pocket watch with a cracked glass face. The second hand was still, but the minute hand trembled slightly, as if trying to move again. Gabriel approached cautiously. The watch seemed to vibrate at the same frequency as the mark on his hand. He looked at the dial and noticed something strange. Instead of ordinary numbers, there were small flower marks, like the brooch's flower, repeated around the circle. Time there was measured by symbol, not numeral. Beside the watch lay a dark-covered notebook, yellowed pages open in the middle. The writing was dense, slanted, done with controlled urgency, like someone trying to record something before thought itself could be stolen. Gabriel didn't read it all at once. His eyes caught fragments, words like cycle, containment, anchor, return, and his name again and again. Then, in a central passage, a sentence hit him hard enough to steal his breath. She didn't stay only out of sacrifice. She stayed because if she left, he would forget again. Gabriel's stomach clenched. That gave shape to something he'd suspected but hadn't dared name. His forgetting wasn't an accident. It was part of the mechanism. To keep living, to avoid going insane from guilt, he had allowed the mansion to hold part of the memory. The house carried the remembrance for him, and the woman, trapped there, served as the emotional guarantee that prevented him from erasing it completely. She wasn't only the entity's counterweight, she was his. Gabriel looked at the shelves and realized many boxes had labels with dates. Old dates, but also recent ones, as if someone kept recording, as if the archive didn't belong only to the past but to a present that repeated. He pulled a box at random. Inside were letters, dozens, some on very old paper, others more recent. Gabriel's heart raced when he recognized his own handwriting on some of them. Not his current hand, but a hand that seemed intermediate, like someone who had written it before and was trying to disguise it. He picked up a recent letter and saw the date, just a few years back. Gabriel frowned. He didn't remember being there. He didn't remember writing anything. But the letter was there, and the floral seal was intact. Understanding came like a cold blow. The cycle had tried to restart multiple times. He had returned at different moments, maybe drawn by dreams, by calls, by inner gaps. And each time he got too close to the truth, the mansion made him forget again, to keep containment working, a system of programmed repetition. He hadn't come back only once. He'd come back many times, and every time she waited. A deep, almost unbearable pain rose in Gabriel as he imagined what it meant to wait through multiple returns, each time with renewed hope and each time with the frustration of erasure. The mansion didn't only keep the secret, it kept a chain of failed attempts. The mark on his hand pulsed harder, and Gabriel noticed a different envelope among the papers. A thicker envelope with the floral seal broken, as if it had been opened and resealed. On it, a single word was written, receipt. Gabriel opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet, written in the same elegant handwriting from the past, but with shakier strokes. It wasn't a letter. It was a record, a list of what had been delivered and what had been taken. Memory, guilt, time, presence, promises. And at the end, one simple devastating line. Everything that was stored must be returned to the world. Gabriel felt a chill rise at the nape of his neck. The final secret wasn't about the entity. It was about the mansion's true function. It didn't only keep things, it accumulated debts, and when it died for good, it would return everything, all at once. The idea was terrifying. If the mansion released all the memories and pain it had hoarded back into the world, what would happen? Where would it go? Who would it fall on? A loud crack sounded from the hall. The house was giving way further. The archive's time was running out. He had to decide what to do with that room, with those letters, with that receipt for what had been stored. The minute hand jumped forward in a small, irregular leap, like a muscle relearning how to move after years of stillness. The sound it made wasn't a normal tick, but a soft snap, almost organic, like a joint settling back into place. Gabriel felt the flower mark on his hand answer with a sharp pain, not unbearable, but intense enough to pull a short breath from him. Time was coming back. Not the mansion's time, circular, contained, diseased, but ordinary time, the kind that doesn't ask permission to move on. Gabriel felt sudden pressure in his head, as if something inside him were rearranging. It wasn't a specific memory yet. It was the anticipation of an avalanche. A mind used to gaps was starting to sense the empty spaces were about to be filled. The archive room reacted. The shelves creaked, and a few boxes slid slightly, as if the floor had tilted by an imperceptible degree. The air grew heavier, charged with emotional static. Gabriel felt the hair on his arms rise. Return time didn't come clean. It came loaded with everything that had been stored along with it. He gripped the pocket watch more tightly, feeling the cold metal against the heat of his skin. The second hand remained frozen, but the minute hand moved in uneven jumps, as if each motion released a different layer of memory. Then the first wave hit. It wasn't an image. It was a feeling, the weight of waiting, the physical sensation of returning to the mansion again and again, always with a vague certainty that something had to be done there, even without knowing what. The frustration of leaving without answers, the false relief of forgetting, all of it stacked at once, and Gabriel staggered, bracing a hand on the table. The flower mark burned. He closed his eyes for a moment and understood that if he let it all come at once, he'd lose control. The mansion had accumulated too much. Decades of emotional fragments, incomplete returns, aborted attempts. That couldn't simply be dumped into his mind without breaking it. Gabriel breathed in and made a silent decision, remember, but at a human pace. Not reject the memories, but not let them flood through him like a breaking dam either. He needed to filter, not by force, but by intention. The mark on his hand answered differently now. The pain eased, becoming a steady pressure, almost guiding. Gabriel realized the mark, once a seal of imprisonment, now worked like a regulator. The last residue of the system could be used against him, or for him. He returned to the table and opened the dark notebook again. When he touched the pages, he felt a faint vibration, as if the paper were linked to the watch. Time, in that room, had been recorded. He read more carefully, but without forcing it. He let the words enter without crushing him. He discovered every return to the mansion had been slightly different. Sometimes he arrived as a curious visitor. Other times he came pulled by recurring dreams. Sometimes he stayed only minutes, other times days. But the pattern never changed. Whenever he got too close to the chamber, something diverted him. A noise, a small collapse, a blackout. The mansion protected him from remembering too much, because remembering too much put the system at risk. It protected him from himself. Gabriel felt a bitter mix of gratitude and rage. The mansion wasn't a simple villain. It was a flawed guardian. It had carried out the function it was given to the limit. Now, without function, it was returning what it never should have kept alone. Something crashed in the hall with a loud echo. The archive room shook, and one of the shelves tilted dangerously. Boxes fell, spilling papers and letters. Time was coming loose in physical scraps. Gabriel understood he had to act. It wasn't enough to accept the return. He had to direct it. The receipt was clear. Everything that had been stored had to be returned to the world. But returning it to the world didn't mean dumping it all into himself. It meant releasing. He crossed to the room's narrow window and forced it open. The cracked glass gave, and cold outdoor air rushed in, carrying the distant sound of wind through leaves. The ordinary world was still there, ready to receive what was being returned. Gabriel gathered the most recent letters, those written by him but never remembered. He didn't read them all. He didn't need to. The symbolic weight was enough. He knew what they contained, attempts to understand, to apologize, to explain to himself what he still couldn't fully remember. He carried the letters to the window and let them go. Paper lifted and scattered through the air like disoriented white birds. Some sheets tore in the wind, others vanished into the distance. Gabriel felt immediate relief, as if a weight had been pulled from his chest. It wasn't forgetting, it was returning. He went back to the table and picked up the pocket watch. The minute hand was moving, more regularly now. Gabriel carefully opened the cracked face and, with a simple motion, removed the mechanism inside. The watch stopped completely. Return time needed to stop there. He placed the dismantled watch in an empty box, closed it, and shoved it deep onto a shelf that was already starting to give way. It wasn't hiding. It was letting it be buried with the mansion. Trapped time shouldn't keep existing in any object. The room jolted violently. Part of the ceiling collapsed near the doorway, partially blocking the exit. Gabriel's heart kicked hard. Time was truly running out now. He looked one last time at the receipt on the table. He didn't tear it. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Some things don't need to be destroyed. They need to be carried consciously. The flower mark pulsed once more, then went quiet. Gabriel drew a deep breath and ran for the door, weaving around debris, feeling the mansion crumble around him. The last secret had been delivered. Time had been returned. Now all that remained was to get out whole, if that was still possible. He staggered through the hall, dodging wood and glass, while the mansion groaned behind him like a body trying to keep its shape out of habit. The front door hung half open, and the gray daylight looked more real than anything that had existed inside. Still, the moment he stepped outside, he felt the true collapse wasn't in the structure anymore. It was about to happen inside him. The final wave came like a tide that doesn't ask permission. It wasn't a single block of memory or a brief vision. It was the last integration, the moment when body and mind, exhausted from splitting, decide to accept the whole truth. Gabriel stopped on the driveway and braced his hands on his knees, breathing hard as cold wind struck his face. The flower mark throbbed one last time, as if opening the final gate. He remembered the name, not as a forbidden word, but as something in his own blood. The name moved through him like something alive and ancient, a presence that had always been there, even when it had been erased. Livia. He didn't speak it out loud, but it had weight. Gabriel's eyes burned, and at the same time he felt a devastating calm. The name was no longer a key, it was goodbye. The image formed completely without mercy. Livia alive in a dim room, hands cold, struggling to breathe, her body already at the limit. The mansion around them, silent, witnessing. Gabriel younger, desperate, refusing the idea that love could end in the same place it began. He didn't accept death as part of love, he accepted death as the enemy of love. So he tried to win. The memory showed the ritual more clearly than ever, not theatrical magic but organized desperation. Candles arranged carefully, symbols carved into stone. The brooch used as an anchor because it was an old family heirloom, an object already soaked in promises. The mansion was chosen because it was made of silence and permanence, because it could hold what no one else could. Then came what Gabriel had always avoided, the moment to consent. Livia wasn't sacrificed against her will. She chose because she loved him. She chose because she understood that if Gabriel tried to keep love by force, he would destroy himself from the inside. She preferred to be the error's counterweight rather than let the error become a larger tragedy. She entered the mansion like someone entering a pact, and in doing so, she turned her own ending into a vigil. Gabriel remembered her look in that moment. Not accusation, not anger, only sadness and care. A care so absolute it hurt. He remembered the way she touched the brooch one last time before pinning it to her dress, as if sealing a promise she didn't want but had to fulfill. And he remembered what came after. The entity. Not a monster born of malice, but an inevitable remainder of an interrupted ending. A hunger for closure, a shadow made of forced continuity, of memory that can't rest. It was born when death was denied. It lived because it was contained, not concluded. And for decades it fed on repetition, on programmed forgetting, on Gabriel's visits, returning without understanding, always pushed by fate. Now, at last, he had broken the key, accepted the ending, returned time, and the entity had vanished because there was no more food, no more refusal. Gabriel straightened slowly, his body heavy with something real, not fear but humanity. The wind carried the smell of rain. Far off, thunder rolled softly, as if the sky were merely confirming ordinary time had resumed its course. Behind him, the mansion cracked loudly. Gabriel turned and saw, tight in the chest, a section of roof giving way. The facade seemed to fold, not like a dramatic collapse, but like a tired body finally allowing itself to fall. Glass broke. Somewhere inside, a portrait crashed. And in a way that wasn't physical, Gabriel felt the house release its last fragment of tension. It wasn't holding anything anymore. Gabriel touched his hand and realized the flower mark was fading, not vanishing instantly, but softening like a scar losing its raised edge. The seal was dissolving because its function was finished. He no longer belonged to the cycle. He was only a man with whole memory. He pulled the folded receipt from his pocket and looked at it, feeling the paper tremble between his fingers. The list of what had been stored, taken, returned, and at the end, the sentence, everything that was stored must be returned to the world. Gabriel understood returning didn't mean throwing away. It meant accepting that it now existed in him, and therefore existed in the world without needing to be buried. There was no more need for the mansion, no more need for containment. He walked to the iron gate and pushed it open. The metal squealed the way it always should have, and for some reason that felt like the most poetic thing of all, an ordinary sound for an unordinary ending. Gabriel stepped through and continued along the dirt road without rushing, like someone no longer running. With each step he felt Livia's absence not as a whole, but as transformed presence. She wasn't there as a shadow, she was there as part of him, memory that doesn't imprison. Halfway down the road, he stopped and closed his eyes, not to look for signs but to let the emotion pass through. Longing came, intense, love came whole, and grief came, finally complete, not violent, but like a deep calm sea. When he opened his eyes, he saw the sky beginning to brighten in a distant band, as if the cloud cover were opening. It wasn't full sunlight, but it was a passage. And Gabriel understood life doesn't offer perfect restarts. It offers continuation with scars. The mansion remained behind him. Somewhere, it would finish falling. Maybe no one would ever find it again. Maybe it would become a ruin swallowed by vegetation, and that was right. Some places don't exist to last. They exist to serve a function and then disappear, taking with them the excess weight no one should carry for decades. Gabriel kept walking, and inside him, Livia's memory remained not as a prison, but as a quiet light. A dark love, yes, born in mystery and death, but still love. And real love doesn't need mansions to survive. It only needs a heart willing to remember without chaining itself to the past. Fate had no more secret doors to offer. Fate now was only the road, and the secret at last could rest.